Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is now time for another 3 hours, another edition of the most disruptive show in those states. In the politically independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're going straight into the news this morning. In a brief coronavirus update, the Freedom on the Net 2020 report, an assessment of 65 countries released Wednesday, found that the pandemic has accelerated a decline in free speech and privacy on the internet for the 10th consecutive year. That report accused some governments of using the virus as a pretext to crack down on critical speech. Residents at a nursing and rehabilitation facility in Greeley, Colorado last week organized a protest against the state's coronavirus restrictions. You're hearing that right. Residents at a nursing and rehabilitation facility. When it's gotten to the point, apparently, that folks at a nursing and rehabilitation facility, not the kinds of folks you'd expect to be staging a protest. You get where I'm going with that, Jamarl. It's a bit out of the norm, at the very least. Judge Amy Coney Barrett. Yeah. It is. Judge Amy Coney Barrett's Supreme Court confirmations hearing continue into their third day today. Yesterday was day 2 of the hearings, and Judge Barrett was questioned about her positions on issues such as abortion and gay rights. She repeatedly cited the quote-unquote Ginsburg rule, so she did not have to engage in hypotheticals. She said, quote, Justice Ginsburg, with her characteristic pithiness, used this to describe how a nominee should comport herself at a hearing. No hints, no previews, no forecasts. That has been the practice of nominees before her, but everybody calls it the Ginsburg rule because she stated it so concisely, and it's been the practice of every nominee since, end quote. She did not use notes for the entire day of questioning, and when asked if she would work to overturn the Affordable Care Act and Roe v. Wade, she said she had made no, quote, commitment, end quote, to do so to the White House. And that's about what you would hope to expect from an incoming judge. You know, you don't want a judge to come in who is basically dangling on the hook given to them by the administration doing what they want to do. That would put the judiciary in a certain degree of disrepair just right out the gate. What's your take on that, Jamarl?
I think we need to stop with the belief that the judiciary is independent. It is not. They wouldn't fight that hard for it if it was. And her not carrying notes or anything, I don't know what that means. It's like, what notes does she have to carry when she already knows what she's going to think about those issues? I mean, come on. Let's be honest.
Yeah, I think the thing here is they put in people with, jurisprudential opinions that they're going to want. So there's going to be bias, but I think it would be a bridge too far to actually make avowed commitments in advance of being put into that position.
I'm saying you don't have to. I'm just saying you don't have to. They already know.
I hear you on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you on that. That's relevant. Today, the New York Post is reporting this. The Obama administration let a Democratic PR company that worked for Ukrainian energy firm Burisma take part in a conference call about an upcoming visit to Ukraine by then Vice President Joe Biden. Those are coming from emails obtained by the Post. An associate at Blue Star Strategies then emailed a memo with minutes of the conference call hosted by the White House to a top Burisma executive, that's Vadim Posharsky, as well as to Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, and Hunter's business partner, Devon Archer, both of whom sat on Burisma's board. The trip in December 2015 turned out to be the one during which Biden later bragged about forcing Ukrainian officials to fire a state prosecutor who was investigating Burisma by threatening to withhold a $1 billion U.S. loan guarantee. The memo, which was sent shortly after that December 2nd, 2015 call, also, quote, outlined the trip's agenda and addressed several questions regarding U.S. policy toward Ukraine, end quote. It's interesting to see this coming out now. I don't know that this is going to get circulated more widely through the media than in the, New York Post sort of Fox News sphere. It's probably not going to affect the election, but it's showing some Obama involvement, them letting the PR company them letting the PR company working for Burisma take part in a conference call, an official government conference call, on these matters. Anyway, more to talk about there later, but that's a little bit of culpability on their part. In Mexico, tensions are rising over a long-standing water dispute between the U.S. and Mexico, pitting Mexican farmers against their own president and the global superpower next door. Farmers armed themselves with sticks, rocks, and homemade shields, ambushed hundreds of soldiers guarding a dam, and seized control of one of the border region's most important bodies of water. The Mexican government was sending their water, to Texas, leaving them next to nothing for their thirsty crops, the farmers said. So they took over the dam and have refused to allow any of the water to flow to the United States for more than a month. Negotiating the exchange of water between the two countries has long been strained, but rising temperatures and long droughts have made these shared rivers along the border more valuable than ever, intensifying the stakes for both nations. This is truly I know that this is an ongoing dispute, and frankly, the region of the United States faced years of drought, shipping water in not just from Mexico, but as far north as Canada, parts of it. It's remarkable, and I'm just going to point out this is all coinciding with a pandemic and nigh economic catastrophe in the U.S. and largely abroad too. It's it's not a good picture. In other words, you're restricting, and for good reason it seems. I'm not really criticizing them, but you're restricting the flow of this most basic natural resource required for your sustenance. You know what I mean, Jamarl? Just an interesting state of affairs.
Yeah, it is, and it's one of those things where, of course, you're going to fight for, right? I mean, this is, like I said, when we have these conversations about mechanical processes, this is kind of one of those things, and this is kind of how it looks, unfortunately. But yeah, you expect them to behave exactly the way they're behaving.
Exactly. Absolutely. All right. Next headline. Lebanon and Israel began indirect talks on Wednesday over their disputed maritime border, with American officials mediating the talks that both sides insist are purely technical and not a sign of any normalization of ties. The U.S. has been mediating that issue for about a decade, but only earlier this month, a breakthrough was reached on an agreement on a framework for U.S. mediated talks. The development comes against the backdrop of Lebanon's spiraling economic crisis, the worst in its modern history, and following a wave of U.S. sanctions that recently included two influential former cabinet ministers allied with the militant Hezbollah group. Israel, the United States, as well as some other Western and Arab countries, considered the Iran-allied Hezbollah a terrorist organization. Beirut hopes that oil and gas discoveries in its territorial waters will help it to overcome the crisis and pay back its massive debt that stands at 170% of the GDP, making it one of the highest debts in the world. This also comes, long-time dispute between Lebanon and Israel. It also comes amid skirmishes, effectively. In recent months, we've been talking about drone strikes over the border, just messy stuff officially between Hezbollah and Israel, but Hezbollah is a political party in Lebanon, so that's the backdrop for that too. Anyway, Jamarl, what's your take?
People keep calling that a terrorist organization, and that is purely from the perspective of the West. Within the context of the country, it's not. It's almost like a military political party of sorts, and so it's a weird perception in the way that the West calls it versus the way that countries within that region will call it. But they're a protector of that country, and they're considered highly, from my understanding, in that region of the world. And so, yeah, like you said, they've been having skirmishes. And, the country is weird also from the political standpoint, just in the way that the parties are separated and everything else, meaning some of the issues that they were having and trying to reconcile after the bomb or after the thing went off, after the explosion. Some of those things were part and parcel to how they were originated, like how that country was formed and so forth, and the rule set that was put in place in regards to the political parties. So yeah, that country has a few problems to solve, and we've had people on to talk about and discuss it, and it's always been an interesting conversation.
It has been, yeah. Now the way that the country was basically divided from the get-go, in terms of sectarian rule, that's a pretty common colonial setup, as far as I know, and that seems to inevitably cause problems later on. you know, different forms it can take. Anyway, next headline here. Yesterday, Apple revealed that the iPhone 12, revealed the iPhone 12, its first 5G phone. Top Chinese social media platforms reportedly pulled their planned coverage of Apple's iPhone 12 live stream despite massive interest in the event. Video platforms such as Tencent Video, IKEA, Bilibili, and Weibo didn't carry the event despite originally planning to. That's coming from Bloomberg. Reports said that the platforms gave no explanation for not showing the event in China, which is Apple's second largest market by revenue. The iPhone 12 was later ranked the top topic on Weibo, with users posting photos of the new phone. In Cambodia, today it was reported that more than 10,000 people have been evacuated after a tropical storm triggered flash floods. Seasonal rains made worse by the storm caused flooding in 19 of the country's 25 provinces, affecting 140,000 people in all. That's coming from a spokesman for the National Committee for Disaster Management. The flooding also destroyed thousands of hectares of rice, he said. The capital, Phnom Penh, was not badly hit, though police moved more than 500 families in a southern part of the city to safer ground. He also said, this is again coming from Kun Soka, a spokesman for the National Committee for Disaster Management, said that the heavy rains have killed at least 11 people since the beginning of the month, and that they're expected to continue until this weekend as 2 more tropical storms are set to hit Cambodia in the next few days. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah,
That's
man.
so grim.
It is. It is. I mean, we've been talking about that over in the States. I'm glad that we're covering those abroad too. But yeah, man, I mean, just a variety of storms. The question, of course, that comes to a lot of people's mind is whether and to what extent these are exacerbated by climate change. I can't tease that apart, but, you know, you do seem to be seeing these coming in more extreme shapes as the years go on.
I don't know if we could tease it apart. I think it's kind of like somebody gaining weight or somebody getting older. It's like, I can't see it in the moment, but if you give a little distance, you can see it. Like, you haven't seen an uncle in 2 or 3 years, but if you were there with them as the person was aging, you wouldn't see the aging. It's kind of like that. It's like, I don't know as a flat fact that this storm was caused by climate, but I definitely know it's getting worse. And like you said, how much?
And I mean, it's especially like if you add to that metaphor, like if the person who's getting older or sicker or weaker needs to do physical stuff, they're going to be a lot more attentive to it. Now, here's how it sort of transposes back onto the other conversation about climate change. If you're a farmer, for instance, if you're having to manage some environment, which a lot of people are, you become aware of this stuff. You know, the climate change, the seasons happening earlier, more volatile heat waves and stuff. It messes with your crops, literally. So, I mean, it happens. Anyway, I'm partly thinking that was a little bit of a tangent. I'm partly thinking about this just because I went up and saw my mom recently, sort of during the virus, during the pandemic, and she farms, she gardens, and she's saying as the years go on, this stuff is hitting earlier and earlier. Heat waves are hitting earlier and in unpredictable times. It's screwing with her crops, messing things up. So I guess, you know, part of where it goes is you might not notice in the year if you're not thinking about it. But for some people, they really do notice it as the years go on. And of course, if you're living in an area that's going to get hit by these storms, you're sure as heck going to notice it too when your property gets destroyed.
You know, I think I was in Warsaw. And I think this was during the time, it was winter. It was going into Christmas. And freezing. And the guy said, he says, you know, it used to be worse. He said, it used to be colder than this. He said, this isn't, you know, I mean, yeah, it used to be worse. It used to be colder. The temperatures have gotten warmer, even there. And even there, in his mind, he's like, this is a warmer temperature. And this was like 0. So it's not just here. It seems to be a phenomenon across the world.
All right, you know what? Let's go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side with Jamarl's monologue. Stay tuned for that. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're listening to us on, please share this content and like that content. Also, if you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, you can send us a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely feel free to call in. Well, yesterday I was watching Judge Amy Coney Barrett give her testimony, giving various people asking her questions and various people making their statements and everything else. And one of the things that I think we need to come to a realization, or at the very least an honest acknowledgement, is that the belief that a judge sits there, wrestles with the law, and then give this impartial, objective opinion is nonsense. Nobody believes that. And as evidence that nobody believes that, you wouldn't have people fighting this hard to stop various people from getting on the bench. Strangely enough, Republicans take this seriously. Obama, for whatever reason, didn't. And I would like to keep pointing out, for all of the consternation and angst that Democrats are having in this moment, it would have been one less person on the bench if Obama would have fought for Merrick Garland. And instead of fighting tooth and nail for Merrick Garland, they're going to play three-dimensional chess and Merrick Garland out, so people will be forced to vote for Hillary Clinton. Just that one extra oomph, so we can get our pick in. That didn't happen. Garland is not in, and right now Trump gets his third pick, and in this case, Amy Coney Barrett. Now the catch with this third pick that Trump is going to get has to do with all sorts of influential issues that all at once come to mind. And honestly, is why Democrats were praying so hard to keep Ruth Bader Ginsburg alive, despite the fact of all the ills and the illnesses that the woman had at her disposal at the time. Obamacare, that's going to be on the chopping block. Roe versus Wade, that's going to be on the chopping block. And of course, the 2020 election. And to make this that much more special, Barrett wouldn't answer any of it. Meaning all of the questions that were asked on those topics, hey, what are you going to do on this? What are you going to do on that? What are you going to do on this? She would not answer any of it. And she would use the deflection. I haven't talked to anybody about those issues. It would be improper for me to talk to anyone about those issues. But here's the catch. You don't have to talk to the person about the issues. You already know where the person stands. You already know what that person is going to do when you put them in that spot. Meaning, the very fact that they picked her for a reason. They know what she's going to do, whether or not they explicitly have the conversation or not. All of those things at this point are on the chopping block. All of those things are up for grabs in regards to her being able to take those things down. And again, I would like to point out that you need to not wave your fist at the sky, not be angry at some, anonymous thing or whatever. Republicans are doing their jobs. Why is your party not? And fact of the matter is, even going up to this election right now, this current election that we're going into, The question that you need to ask yourself is basically, why are the Democratic Party, why is it willing to risk what they consider to be the world in the way that they talk about it? They consider Donald Trump to be a maniac. Why would they be willing to risk that as opposed to appropriating policy that would bring people to their fold? Why would they be willing to risk this country and Donald Trump getting 2 more Supreme Court picks as opposed to backing policy that would organically bring the country, or for that matter, the party together to win? When you get angry and you say, oh, Jill Stein, and you point to Coney as some rationale to go against Jill Stein or some rationale to go against third parties, I want you to remember this moment. You had the opportunity to push for that stuff. You didn't do it. You had the opportunity to fight for a Supreme Court pick. You didn't do it. Even in that moment, you didn't do it. And Hillary Clinton, who could have appropriated Medicare for all, could have appropriated the elimination of student debt or any of those other policies that would have organically brought people together. She didn't do it. And right now, Donald Trump is in office putting in Supreme Court picks that Hillary Clinton could have put in had Hillary Clinton appropriated policy that the majority of the public, or at the very least, lefties, would have backed. There was no hope of change. That was a Pepsi commercial. And Hillary Clinton didn't even go that far in trying to push even that basic narrative of trying to get people to accrue, missing the point that elections are about votes and getting people about votes and getting people to make those votes for that particular candidate, because that candidate is pushing policies that those people need. Joe Biden may need to think about that. I understand that Joe Biden believes that he's going to win it hands down. I understand that the polling and everything indicates that Joe Biden is going to be, it's going to be a blowout. Hillary also thought she was going to blow the doors off of it. And truth be told, your country is in need. There is a pandemic. There are people out of work. There are people who are being thrown out of their homes. All of these things are right now taking place, and it seems like America is an afterthought. I would say this. Judge Amy Coney is not going to answer any of these questions, because any of these questions would create that much of a headwind. So her response is, I haven't talked to anyone, as if you have to have explicit conversations for people to know what the judge is going to do. You don't. The Supreme Court is a political instrument every bit as much as the other 2 branches of government. And at some point, the political parties are going to start treating it as such. And at that point, all pretense of the idea of a impartial Supreme Court are going to go out the window. Because I hate to tell you, they're already out the window. Yes, everything is on the chopping block this year. And this is going to be a major swing in the power of the court to the right. Shane, what do you think about this? I'm curious. I've seen the Supreme Court as a political instrument for years now. And I always thought it was weird that people pretended that it wasn't. And yet they'd fight like the Dickens, and they would make that argument that, hey, you got to fight for the Supreme Court, or you got to vote for this particular person or that particular person for the Supreme Court. Why? Because the Supreme Court matters as a political instrument where it takes it to the left or to the right, especially when those things are going to go to the courts. Yeah, it's a political instrument. I mean, can we just stop the pretense at this point in this country?
That would be good. So 2 things here. One thing, the Ginsburg rule to me seems pretty reasonable. The problematic part of this, though, it's not that they're not talking about it. It's just the intense politicization and the fact that when the people, you're commenting on these hearings as if they're supposed to be sort of like a divining rod, figuring out where she's going to go. I don't think, I don't know that we should be doing that. I think that you in the same way that you shouldn't be trying to put somebody in because their political convictions perfectly match yours, you also shouldn't be trying to take somebody out just because their political convictions don't match yours. In other words, the sword slices both ways. If what's good for the goose is good for the gander, if the whole thing is politicized, then it feels hypocritical for one side to be complaining that their political candidate isn't getting the pick. If it comes down to raw power, going back to the Merrick Garland conversation and how sheerly the Democrats did not have the majority that they needed to get it through. And now, now the Republicans do, and so they're going to do it. What they said before, be damned. You can make those arguments too. We've had that conversation. But thing one is, it just shouldn't be politicized at all. Now, thing two is, and this is a slightly weirder take, it seems like the problem with parties functionally, if you can predict what a judge is going to do, how they're going to act, based on how well they're aligned with your party, isn't that a problem with your political system in general? Like, shouldn't we have more complicated justices and more complicated political systems than this weird binary split thing, this weird duopoly that we're living in right now? Because if we did, then what you'd get over time is a little bit more of a balance of different views, where it's not just the Republicans, packing the court when they can, and the Democrats packing the court when they can. You'd get a weirder balance of views, because as different parties moved in and out of power, assuming one, didn't attain a long-lasting supermajority or whatever, more and more parties moved in and out of power and brought their justices in, just using this setup with the Supreme Court. You can envision different judicial systems on the high level, but just looking at it from this setup, I think you'd get a more balanced go at it in the long run. Does that make sense, Jamarl? What's your take?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think the thing is, you have two political parties, and with two political parties, you're going to have a party that puts somebody in for their interests. Like, it would be weird if they did. Like, where's all the impetus? Where's the incentive? The incentive is, I want to put somebody in that when a bill or when a law or when something goes to court, that person is going to be thinking of my interests. All the incentive in the world is to do that. So if you end up with just two political parties, well, the political parties are incentivized to basically look out for their own specific interests. I think it would be weird if they did. Now, how does that work in practice? Like this, where you basically have each party putting on somebody on the bench that would be in their interests. And honestly, like, in their interests in ways that go well beyond any notion of America. I mean, Roe v. Wade, she seems to be a hawk against that. She just does. And if you're looking at the Obamacare thing or even the election, all of these things, she's given no answers into whether or not she's going to be for or against it. But you kind of have in your head that if Republicans are choosing her, she's probably going to be in their interests for those items. And so understand not giving any kind of heads up in regards to what you're going to do. But if they already know, then you don't need to give a heads up. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. The heads up thing is a dodge. It's a red herring. It's a fig leaf. When the reality of it is, they chose her because they know her position. And that's our court. I mean, that's not an impartial device. That's a device that
but
clearly knows where it's going. I'm sorry, go for it.
Here's the problem. I can just see each side assuming the absolute worst about the other party and the other party's motivations, often, with justification. But whether that's a reality or not, it's damn frustrating. And I don't know how many times I can say this without it getting old, and probably it already is. It's damn frustrating that we're living in a political system where each party does assume the worst constantly, is constantly taking, the other's picks, the other's intents, in a bad faith light, assuming the worst about them. And then I know that what's going to happen is that on the other side, whatever happens, whoever, of course she's going to get put in, that in retrospect, they will do the exact same thing, the Democrats and the media, whether it's right or it's wrong. And it's that kind of like vindictive oppositionality that in the long run, whether it's justified to hold or not, it's just so damn frustrating that we're living in that political system. Anyway, we've got to go into a break. We will be back on the other side of this break with Stephen Lenman talking about Nagorno-Karabakh and foreign policy. Be back with Stephen in a minute. Until then, you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And our guest for this segment and the next, Stephen Lendman. He's an author and a geopolitical analyst. And by the way, you can read his articles at stephenlendman.org. Stephen, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Oh, I'm doing fine. Shane and Jamal, I'm happy to be on with you.
Thank you again for being with us. All right, we're talking about Nagorno-Karabakh, conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Over the weekend, going into the weekend, there were hopes that there was going to be a ceasefire. And then a ceasefire was actually, it seemed like it had been reached. And then it seemed to have fallen apart again with Armenia and Azerbaijan getting back into it. Can you please give us your breakdown of what happened there and what you think it would take to get a long-lasting ceasefire, maybe not just a frozen conflict, but some sort of actual resolution of the underlying problem here? What's your take on that, Stephen?
Oh, boy, what would it take to do it? Number one, I would say until late September, probably 99.9% of people in the U.S., maybe in the West entirely, never heard of Nagorno-Karabakh. There was a big war back in the early 1990s, killed thousands of people, but that was a long time ago. And many young people were either too young to understand it or know anything about it. And if what's going on hadn't happened, those two terms would be meaningless, let alone most people knowing where this enclave, people would know whether it's a country, an enclave, or whatever, but where it is, what's going on, what countries are surrounding it, which ones are involved in what's going on now. It will be very, very hard to institute a ceasefire that will hold. Even if one is instituted, it could crumble any time. The big war happened in the early 90s, but then sporadic conflicts between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the territory. It's complicated. Nagorno-Karabakh, an enclave, is in Azerbaijan's territory. It's internationally recognized as Azerbaijan territory. On the other hand, the majority of the people in the enclave are Armenians. So both countries have a legitimate interest in the enclave. It's a shame they can't resolve their differences peacefully, democratically, diplomatically, rather than by conflict. It keeps happening over and over, and what's happening now is rather serious. It's been going for about 2 weeks. Key is whether Russia, Sergei Lavrov, can get both sides to sit down again. They spoke for about 10 hours last Friday. Lavrov understood very well that ceasefires are never easy to get sides to agree to. And even when they do agree to them, and even if they hold, it usually takes a while. There were usually continued fighting for at least a little while before it petering out. But this one hasn't taken hold at all. Fighting continues straight through the ceasefire talks. Continued over the weekend. They're raging now. Hundreds of people have died. Basic infrastructure in Nagorno-Karabakh has been destroyed or heavily damaged. The people are living in basements. They're versions of bomb shelters because in some places it's impossible to stay outside for more than a few moments and not risk getting killed or seriously hurt. It's a very, very tough situation. I'm convinced that the U.S. and Turkey Well, Turkey has a stake in this fight. It supports Azerbaijan. It's supplying weapons, as Israel is doing, to Azerbaijan. But the U.S. would very much like to draw Russia and Iran into the conflict. Maybe some Western countries would want to as well. Russia and Iran absolutely do not want to be drawn into this, because then it could draw Western nations into it, countries lining up on either side of the conflict, some supporting Armenia, some supporting Azerbaijan. And you got a global situation going, which Russia absolutely wants prevented. I'm sure Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who if anybody deserves a Nobel Peace Prize, it's Lavrov, because among everybody in the world, he probably is the leading diplomatic figure in getting involved in trying to resolve conflicts. He's done a wonderful job, but he's not a miracle maker. Nobody can resolve what warring parties do not want resolved. If he can pull it off in between Armenia and Azerbaijan, that will be an extraordinary achievement. It will take all of his formidable negotiating powers to be able to come close to doing this. I certainly wish him well and hope he succeeds.
Let me ask you this, Stephen. This gets into an interesting question on Putin's or Russia's influence, meaning the Putin administration or the Russian government, for the most part, like you said, does not want this to go, does not want this to keep going. I mean, they tried to bring in the ceasefire. So this gets to a question of how much influence does Russia have in this situation? I mean, considering that it seems that this was a frozen conflict, it seems that Turkey's influence on Azerbaijan at least allowed this conflict to, let's say, gain legs or more legs than it had prior. What is Russia's influence in this? And will they have, let's say, I guess, the political influence to bring these sides apart, or at the very least, to create a balance? Because basically what it boils down to is Azerbaijan's argument is we're tired of the status quo and we're no longer going to accept the status quo of Armenia or Nagorno-Karabakh staying there, basically under Armenian influence. So it's like, how does this ever get resolved? And will Russia have the influence necessary on both parties to bring them to the bargaining table to end this?
Well, I agree. I'm sure that Azerbaijan started this conflict, this round of conflict. I don't know the history of who did what over the past 25 years or so, but Azerbaijan is definitely responsible for starting this conflict. In July and August, its military held joint exercises with Turkish forces. I think Turkey has been egging Azerbaijan on to do this. Statements by Turkish President Erdogan have been very supportive of Azerbaijan, and by implication very hostile toward Armenia, and supplying weapons, which Israel is doing as well. I saw one quote that Israel may be supplying 60% of Azerbaijan's weapons, heavy weapons, missiles, things like that. Turkey supplying heavy weapons as well. I mean, you put heavy weapons into a belligerent country, and they're going to end up using them. And what's going on had to be planned many weeks in advance. I suspect the military exercises with Turkey were part of planning for the war on Armenia that began on the 27th of September, and now it's the 14th of October, and nothing close to resolution is in prospect. Russia very much wants to stay neutral on this, wants to bring them both together. One problem for Russia is, along with Armenia and other countries in the region, Russia is a member of the CSTO, good heavens, cooperation, security, a security cooperation agreement. It states that if any CSTO member is attacked by a foreign force, the other members are obligated to defend the country that is under attack. So if Azerbaijan or another country attacks Armenia directly, invades, shells, bombs, whatever, then Russia will be forced to get involved directly, which is trying very hard not to do. Because if Russia gets on the side of, again, defending Armenia, then who'll get on the side of Azerbaijan defending its interests? Turkey, I guess, for sure. Will the U.S. do it? Will Britain, France, Germany, will they do it? It's a very tough situation. Also, Iran borders Azerbaijan and Armenia. Iran is very concerned that fighting could spill over the borders into its territory It does not want to be involved in this conflict. It wants to be a peacemaker, not a war maker. But if too much conflict spills over into its territory, it has to defend itself. It also has a large Azeri population. It's concerned about serving them, people bordering Azerbaijan. This thing is just awfully complicated. And the fact that it's been festering, not just for the past 25 years or so, this goes back centuries. I think at least to the 19th century. I think even earlier than that, when the territory belonged to who knows who, a century, 2, 3, or 4 ago. So there are differences between what's now Armenia and Azerbaijan that goes way back. How do you resolve this in a few days? You can't do it. This would take extensive talks mediated by Russia, hopefully somebody else as well if they want to get involved, with both sides and convince them that peace is better than war, because nobody's going to win a war if it keeps going. There'll be destruction, and if it does keep going, there's a very good chance it's going to spill into the territory of Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that would be devastating.
Who would be on that other side, Stephen? Who? I mean, you mentioned Russia on one side and a potential unknown party on the other side. The only relevant party that's currently engaged in the conflict that I can see would be Turkey. But like you're saying, they were egging Azerbaijan on it. It appears, and I don't want to say that authoritatively, I've seen some of that stuff. This actually comes, though, as they're denying sending troops from Turkey, from Syria into Azerbaijan. This is based on reporting from Guardian and other outlets within the last month. They're basically saying they didn't do that, apparently. Who would you see on the other side of that table, Stephen?
Well, I'm convinced that the U.S. and Israel would love drawing Iran into the conflict. The U.S. would love drawing Russia into the conflict. Russia and Israel have decent relations. I don't know that they're warm, but Vladimir Putin a couple of years ago invited Netanyahu to the Great Patriotic War commemoration, commemorating the end of World War II. Forget the year 2017 or 2018. Invited Putin to be on the reviewing stand with him, so it showed there's a good relationship between both countries. I don't think Israel is hostile toward Russia, but of course Israel and the U.S. are extremely tight, and anybody the U.S. is against, the bottom line might be that it would draw Israel against that country as well. But so far Israel is not against Russia, but certainly could become that. But the U.S. absolutely would love drawing Iran and Russia into this conflict. It would give the U.S. I don't think the U.S. wants to go to war with Russia, but if Iran gets involved, it would give the U.S. a pretext for going to war against Iran. That's what would be devastating. That could really draw Russia into it.
Stephen, let's do this. Let's take a break because we only have about a minute or two before this is over with, and I'm going to bring you back in. And I want to get into what does Turkey get out of this? Because it just seems like they are working in tandem with Azerbaijan. And I tend to go along with this notion that governments or countries don't necessarily engage in things unless they're going to get something out of those things to which they engage in. And so the question becomes, what is Turkey, or specifically Erdogan, getting out of this, or let's say the full-throated support that he's given behind Azerbaijan in this conflict? Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Our guest is Stephen Lindeman, author and geopolitical analyst. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays, when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. We are here with author and geopolitical analyst Stephen Lindeman. Stephen, I want to get into what Turkey gets out of this, because it's a frozen conflict. You have Azerbaijan that is greatly unhappy with the situation. And like you said, the world says it's their land, it's their territory, and they believe it's their territory. They want it back. Armenia basically saying this is a war of independence or a self-determination. This is the way they cast it. And as such, there's no way to mend the gap. And so it feels like, or seems like, something needs to be given for Azerbaijan to say, okay, we're happy with this conflict. But there doesn't seem to be any space for that to take place. Turkey seems to be full-throatedly, to put it mildly, at least in the interviews I've listened to, behind Azerbaijan. Why? What is Turkey, or what do they expect to get out of a conflict like this?
Turkish President Erdogan has neo-Ottoman aspirations. I think that's really what it's all about. He's in northern Syria, occupying Syrian territory. He wants to annex northern Syria, which he will not do, but that's what he wants. He wants to annex northern Iraq because it's loaded with oil he wants to get his hands on. He's got a conflict. He's not fighting. He's got a diplomatic dispute going with Cyprus over exploration for gas, and with his gas is probably oil in the Mediterranean, and France is very hostile to what Turkey is doing, not doing anything about it, but very, very upset about it. Cyprus is a member of the EU. Turkey is not, so I guess you support one of your EU nations. But Erdogan has great aspirations. He wants Turkey to be a greater power than it is now, and I think that's what lies behind what's going on. Turkey borders Armenia. To the east of Armenia is Azerbaijan. If anything, you would think, well, there was an Armenian genocide over a century ago that Turkey was responsible for. I was going to say, you would think a nation bordering another might want to have good relations with that nation, but certainly that is not the case between Turkey and Armenia, and I doubt that it ever was, at least for the past century. I don't know what it was long before that. But Turkey is hostile to Armenia, so it's natural for it to line up with Azerbaijan. They're both Muslim countries. Armenia, ever check the population breakout, the religious breakout of Armenia? I think it's more Christian than anything else. But Azerbaijan, at least, is mostly Muslim. Turkey is Muslim, so there's a natural affinity there. But the bottom line with Erdogan, I think, isn't religion, it's power. Power. He wants to get as much of it as possible, and wealth as well, so he wants as much oil as he can control. This is what he does. He's a thug. Russia tolerates him. I don't know how, barely, I guess. He's a very tough guy to work with. Over the years, I've written an awful lot about the horrors he's committed, both abroad and internally toward countries. Anybody who criticizes him and gets caught doing it publicly can go to prison in Turkey. So if the U.S. There are terrible policies, but everybody is free to bash Republicans or Democrats if they wish, and nobody's going to be punished for that. You do it against Erdogan in Turkey and get caught, you're going to go to prison, including children. He'll put children in prison. That's the kind of guy he is.
That's the dismal picture of Turkey. You were talking about France earlier. France, along with the United States and Russia, part of the OSCE Minsk group, responsible for trying to, bring a peaceful, I'm going to quote here literally, peaceful negotiated resolution to the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The two main players there are Russia and the United States. How significant do you think France is? Just taking them, looking at Macron, but not just Macron, looking back at the history over the past couple of decades. Do you think they're going to bring anything in terms of balancing this conflict, or do you think they're going to stay out? Do you see them having any efficacy here, Stephen? What's your take?
We know the way the U.S. operates. It's waging endless wars by hot and other means, the other means being sanctions and other dirty tricks. Hot wars, we know what they are all about. The U.S. is abhorrent to peace, and it shows by its policy in one country after another. What's going on between the U.S. and Iran right now, it's barely short of a hot war, but the sanctions, maximum pressure on Iran, just devastating stuff, including the most recent ones on 18 Iranian banks that were not sanctioned up to now, and it's what Foreign Minister Zarif of Iran called medical terrorism, to literally not not overtly threaten, but indirectly threaten other countries not to export anything medically related to Iran, so people can't get medical supplies for medical treatment, drugs or whatever. This is the way the U.S. operates. So I think the U.S. would like to see the conflict get even more extreme than it is already, rather than being a peace broker. When was the last time the U.S. ever really, for real, tried to negotiate a peace anywhere? What Russia does all the time. So I think the U.S. is on the side of fostering conflict, opposing peace. It's up to Russia to do it, mainly. Iran very much wants to do it, but Russia certainly is very, very experienced and adept at this, and certainly is a chance that Lavrov can pull it off. But it will take time. If it happens, it will take time. This thing could go on for weeks, a month, and if Lavrov is successful, it may not be for a very long time from now. I'm sure he won't quit.
Stephen, what leverage does Russia have at its disposal to bring this to a resolution? Because I can see, and I guess this could be asked in two ways. A, what leverage do they have at their disposal to bring these guys to the negotiating table and resolve the conflict? And I'm putting resolve in quotes. And what does that look like? Because again, Azerbaijan does not look like it seems, just going by the interviews, that in their mind this is our territory. We want our territory back. And we are now in a position to do something about it where we can take it. So what's the leverage? What's the clout that they can pull together in order to bring these guys to some resolution? And what does that resolution look like?
Well, I'm not a conflict resolution negotiator, but I would imagine at least one thing that Lavrov is explaining to both parties, and of course they're expressing all their grievances when they get together. But I'm sure Lavrov is stressing that nobody will win this conflict. One side may come out better than the other side, but both sides are heavily armed. They can inflict serious damage on throughout Nagorno-Karabakh. The cost of continuing the conflict can be much greater than what either side gets out of it. Really, Azerbaijan, because they're the ones that initiated it. They may come out the winner short term because of this. It won't prevent conflict erupting again if it comes to a halt, because Armenia just throws up its hands and quits and says, the heck with this thing. It could start up again. But the price that Azerbaijan would pay for whatever we may get will be maybe infinitely more than they ever can gain by this. And certainly the war can spill over the borders into its territory. You'll have its soldiers killed, its people killed, its infrastructure destroyed. This is what wars do. And even winners. World War II was an aberration for a country like the U.S. It never touched U.S. soil, except Hawaii at the very beginning. But the U.S. came out unscathed. The countries that were in the war were devastated by it, and Russia especially. Probably took Russia a generation to come back from World War II, losing 25 million people and just vast destruction across the country. So even coming out, and Russia was the main combatant country in defeating Nazi Germany. The U.S. was a secondary player in defeating Nazi Germany. But Russia paid an enormous price. As brutal as Stalin was way back, I don't think he wanted nothing to do with the war. There was the pact with Molotov and Ribbentrop that he tried to avoid a war with Nazi Germany. Probably realizing you can't negotiate with these people; they'll betray you, when they did. But he bought himself some time, which is all he accomplished. But they'll both be losers. Azerbaijan and Armenia will both be losers, greater losers the longer this thing goes on. I'm sure this is what Lavrov is stressing with both sides, and I'm sure he'll continue doing it. Maybe he can make some progress on this.
This comes as I literally just saw from Sputnik coming in. As Azerbaijan has declared that it's taken a few settlements on the periphery of Nagorno-Karabakh. That is the status here. It seems like it's not a stalemate. There's some slow progress there. That's sad to see as somebody who would prefer this all end peacefully. But I guess, in closing, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Only so many ways to ask this question, but what can Russia do? They are the outside party here. If they start to intervene just to try to break it down here, they're probably going to incite some response from other members of NATO, opportunistically possibly, who would step in and try to agitate for war. frankly, this comes amid, the backdrop of a pandemic, a pending economic crisis. In some countries, it's not so pending. It seems like in some ways the least opportune time for a war, if there ever is an opportune time for a war. But what would it take for not just Armenia and Azerbaijan, but for Turkey and more widely for any parties who would agitate for that war? What would it take for them to have the sense to not pursue it in this time, Stephen?
Well, if I was Sergei Lavrov, I know what I would do. I would keep talking to both sides, the leaders, the foreign ministers of both sides, the leadership of both sides, trying to get them together for direct talks, talking to them over the phone, doing it day after day after day after day, just pounding them with diplomacy and just hoping like hell that maybe that it could be successful, and to get these guys to pull back a little bit and think about what they're doing and the harm it would cause themselves. It may not work, but that's the only thing Lavrov can try.
One last point. Do you think anybody else is getting involved in this? Like, the U.S. doesn't seem to be involved. Like, it just seems to be out of it. And I don't know if it's because, like Shane said, we have all of these things that we're dealing with in this country. But it seems like we're outside of this. It really does seem like the major players in this is basically Turkey. And like you said, they're getting the weapons from Israel. What do you think about the election, and does the election in any way have any influence on that event? Meaning, if Biden gets in, or for that matter, if Trump ends up winning, does the tenor of this country have any effect on what is going on in that conflict, or let's say the tenor of the election?
I think the U.S. election will have zero effect. Dems are more belligerent than Republicans. If anything, if Dems get in, there'd be a greater chance of the U.S. wanting to get into it, and a lesser chance if Trump was reelected. How about that?
No, that's perfect. I mean, that totally makes sense. I mean, like you said, Dems are more belligerent. And my biggest concern is that over the past, 3 or 4 years, there's been the Russiagate stuff. And because it's been so belligerent and so over the top, and even now, even as planks of the Russiagate thing fall apart in courtrooms, and just in discourse, that still hasn't stopped Democrats from that mindset. And so it's like if Biden gets in, that's the mindset that these guys are getting in with. And to me, that is terrifying because of the implications that could have on a Biden administration and his tenure in that office. What do you think about this?
It really is. Oh, it really is. And Lavrov said, I think he said it a couple of times, if the U.S. didn't find one thing to bash Russia about, it would invent something else. If the Navalny poisoning didn't exist, there would have been something else that they would hit Russia over the head with. That's exactly right. And the Dems are more hostile to Russia than Trump is, for sure. Trump would like to have a business relationship with Russia. Dems simply want to beat Russia over the head, diplomatically.
Yeah, I agree with that, Stephen. So you guys are listening to Stephen Lindman, author and geopolitical analyst. Stephen, I want to thank you for coming on to the show. Up next, guys, we have headlines that's coming up in a couple of minutes. Shane, is there anything you want to say in closing this one out?
Yeah, I mean, war still takes place on the face of this globe. We're from the American perspective, for most people, unless you went to Vietnam, unless we fought wars, of course. But it's been decades since most Americans have faced the prospect of a draft or something like that. But I'm going to quote here from Lavrov. You look now at the Nagorno-Karabakh capital city of Stepanakert, a drone. It looks like a city after the Second World War, quote, end quote. That's happening right now. We want to talk about it more, but that is happening right now. And of course, what's most scary about that, not just that it's happening right now, but that it could escalate and turn into some larger regional or global conflict. In any event, we've got to go into a break. We will be back on the other side of this break with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. In the news, Freedom of the Net 2020 report, an assessment of 65 countries released Wednesday, found that the pandemic has accelerated a decline in free speech and privacy on the internet for the 10th consecutive year, and accused some governments of using the virus as a pretext to crack down on critical speech. Residents at a nursing home and rehabilitation facility in Greeley, Colorado, organized a protest last week against the state's coronavirus restrictions. Shane, I just want to point out, that's so bizarre. Like, a nursing home? I don't think I've ever heard a nursing home organizing a protest on anything. Am I insane on that?
No, that is the notable part of that story. That is why we're reading that story out. It's remarkable, man. Yeah.
Every time I hear that, I think a nursing home did that. A nursing home did that. It's just so wild. Let's go to the next one. Judge Amy Coney Barrett Supreme Court confirmation hearing continue in its third day today. Yesterday was day 2 of the hearing, and Judge Barrett was questioned about her position on issues such as abortion and gay rights. She repeatedly cited the Ginsburg rule, so she did not have to engage in hypotheticals. She said Justice Ginsburg, with her characteristic pithiness, used this to describe how a nominee should comport herself at a hearing. No hints, no previews, no forecasts. That has been the practice of nominees before her, but everybody calls it the quote-unquote Ginsburg rule because she stated it so concisely, and it's been the practice of every nominee since. She did not use notes for the entire day of questioning. She asked if she could work to overturn, or if she would work to overturn the Affordable Care Act and Roe v. Wade. She said she's made no commitments to do so to the White House. Now, Shane, yes, she might have made no commitments. And I imagine nobody at the White House asked her because they understood that she would not make any commitments. But do you believe that the White House, that has every advantage or instinct in the world to overturn Obamacare, to potentially stay in there with the election, meaning do you believe that they would put her in that spot if they didn't have any belief of what she'd do? No, of course not. No, it's intensely politicized. Yeah. But again, it's politicized on both sides. That's the thing. How much can you really? How do ethical arguments fly if both sides have long since abandoned ethics, or are we just sort of using ethics as a popcorn while we, watch what's going on? Does that make sense? It seems like a little bit superficial. I think we need to have I think the problem is when we look at this stuff, we have to gauge it somehow. And I think we have to frame it in a right or wrong. Otherwise, it's hard to kind of, negotiate it, even though right or wrong almost doesn't apply when ethics are out of the window. I'm always interested in your take on this stuff because I've long since given up that these guys are ethical. And I think sometimes you take the take that we need to get to a better place somehow in politics. Now, the catch becomes, how do you do that? Like, when you have a situation where one side is unethical in the mix, the other side, almost by definition, has become unethical just to compete. It's like if you have a weightlifting contest, and one guy's lifting, 300 pounds. The other guy takes steroids, he lifts 500. What is the guy who can only lift 300 going to do? Is he going to stay ethical, even though he loses by being ethical? Or is he going to start taking steroids so he can lift 550 pounds? It's the same thing in your political space. It's, in fact, in politics in general. If one country puts weapons in space, the other country has to do it by definition, just to remain and to keep balance. And here, you have something happening in our political space that's the same. So I guess it's like the question becomes, how do you ever move yourself to a better ethical space, the Marianne Williamson space? How do you get there in a system that is rotted and just ensconced in corruption?
Well, you've got to build up ethics. You've got to build up a system of civilization. I would use that word specifically, a system of civilization once you get to that large scale, that can restrain the forces of power and that gives legitimacy only to those powers that are good for people who live in that civilization. And it's not, some people have taken historically, religion has played a large role. I think that we're living in an era where religion is not going to play as large a role, or if it does, it'll take some other form. Some people might disagree with that, but that's my take. It seems like in the last couple of centuries in Western, quote unquote, developed countries, it's taken a sort of philosophical, ideological tack, and that has some merit, but there are questions about that. Eddie, this is a huge conversation, man, but broadly, what you want is for people to support those leaders who can bring them genuine goods, genuine moral goods. And obviously effective leaders too. If you don't have that, then I think eventually they get displaced. I think that's where legitimacy comes in. But frankly, it operates on both ends. You need better leaders, but in order to have better leaders, you need to reward better leaders too. In the case of, you were bringing up wrestlers or fighters, one who weighs a lot more, one who weighs less. Maybe the one who weighs more is taking steroids or doing something like that. And it's this arms race of competition. Well, what usually restrains those kinds of things is you have some outside body that can moderate, the excesses of the sport. In politics, that's people. That's people on the low level as well as on the high level. People, the public in a sort of general sense, as well as various elites within the elite ruling class. I guess here's one way of looking at it. Maybe historically, during some particular times of history, we have actually had more or less ethical and functional societies, more or less by the standards of their time. They've done pretty well. And I think all we can aim for practically is to have more of both of those things, more ethical and more functional societies. And it's possible. We don't see it right now because it seems like we're on the downswing, but it is possible. That's what I'd aim for anyway.
I think what happens is that people get so sick of it being ensconced in horrid people. I mean, I think at some point it gets sick of it. The people get tired of it. And I think those are the periods that you're talking about. Like right now we might be on the downswing, but at some point the public gets so tired of it that the public gets engaged and your society for a bit of time changes when it goes on an upswing. And then at some point somebody realizes we can take advantage by being crooks, and it goes on a downswing again. Do you think this is just how society is? Like, do we get to a point in society where it realizes, all right, we need to put in procedures in place to prevent the downswing on this? Or is it always up and down, where people get tired of the corruption, they get tired of criminal politicians or corporate structures, and they make adjustments to it, but the adjustments are always cyclical? If so, that's not great. That's not great.
Yeah, this is the question of whether or not there can be an immortal society or an immortal polity. Whether you can, if you think about it, whether you're going to live in a functional society that's just going to continue to improve, or at least is going to reach some steady state where it works. It works for the people within it. People feel happy living within it. And for a long time, that's not a utopia. Like it could still have problems. But for a lot of people, that would probably be enough, as if they lived in something that was stable across, long time spans. I think where you want to look, though, is that historically, like all different forms of life, and civilization is very clearly a form of life in this larger sense. There are cyclical periods of growth and death. But I think, like the push to, elongate human lives, we might want to consider doing the same thing for civilizations. It's just making sure that the civilization that you're trying to elongate is not going to be a dystopic one. It's not going to try to oppress you. It's not going to do these various things that inhibit human potential in really negative ways. Anyway, those are super abstract things. I think to answer your question, yes, it's cyclical because that's sort of the nature of this whole entropic growth machine that we're living in. But if you look in history, There are societies that have lasted longer. There's societies that have lasted very short periods of time. We should probably aim for better ones that last longer. That seems stable to me in a useful, productive, flourishing way,
Yeah, I don't think it's impossible at all. I mean, like you said, the thing is figuring out what allows the society to live longer versus less. What are the things that add to life? What are the things that benefit life? And what are the things that keep people whole so they don't try to burn down that society? Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's just something needs to be focused on and thought about. And we don't. We lurch. We lurch along as a world or as a society with people trying to get their own specific individual interests served. And unfortunately, that has negative outcomes, in the long run. Now, I do think it's possible, but we're not there yet. Let's go to the next one. So today, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, no, go for it. Go for it, Jamarl.
Okay, so let's go to the next one. Today, the New York Post is reporting the Obama administration let a Democratic PR company that worked for the Ukrainian energy firm Burisma take part in a conference call about an upcoming visit to the Ukraine by then President Joe Biden. Emails obtained by the Post show. An associate at Blue Star Strategies then emailed a memo with minutes of the conference call hosted by the White House to top Burisma executive Vand Parishki, as well as to Joe Biden's son Hunter and to Hunter business partner Devon Archer, both of whom sat on Burisma's board. The trip in December 2015 turned out to be the one during which Biden later bragged about forcing Ukrainian officials to fire a state prosecutor who was investigating Burisma by threatening to withhold a $1 billion U.S. loan guarantee. The memo, sent shortly after the December 2nd, 2015 call, also outlined the trip's agenda and addressed several questions regarding the U.S. policy towards Ukraine. Tensions are rising in Mexico over a long-standing water dispute between U.S. and Mexico, pitting Mexican farmers against their own president and the global superpower next door. The farmers armed themselves with sticks, rocks, and homemade shields, ambush hundreds of soldiers guarding a dam and seizing control of one of the border's region's most important bodies of water. The Mexican government was sending their water, to Texas, leaving them next to nothing for their thirsty crops, the farmers said. So they took over the dam and have refused to allow any of the water to flow to the United States for more than a month. Negotiating the exchange of water between the two countries has long been strained, but rising temperatures and long droughts have made the shared rivers along the border more valuable than ever, intensifying the stakes for both nations. Lebanon and Israel have began indirect talks Wednesday over the disputed maritime border, with American officials mediating the talks that both sides insist are purely technical and not a sign of a normalizing of ties. The United States has been mediating the issue for a decade, but earlier this month a breakthrough was reached on an agreement on a framework for the United States mediated talks. The development comes against the backdrop of Lebanon's spiraling economic crisis, the worst in modern history, and following a wave of U.S. sanctions that recently included two influential former cabinet ministers allied with the militant Hezbollah group. Israel, the United States, as well as some of the other Western and Arab countries, consider the Iran-allied Hezbollah a terrorist group. Beirut hopes that the oil and gas discoveries in its territorial waters will help it overcome the crisis and pay back its massive debts that now stands at 170% of GDP, making it one of the highest in the world. And last, yesterday, Apple revealed the iPhone 12, its first 5G phone. Top Chinese social media platform reportedly pulled their planned coverage of Apple's iPhone 12 live stream despite massive interest in the event. Video platforms such as Tencent Video, Ikea, Bilibili, and Webio didn't carry the event despite originally planning to do so, Bloomberg reported. The report said the platform gave no explanation for not showing the event in China, Apple's second largest market in revenue. The iPhone 12 was later ranked the top topic on Webio, with users posting photos of the new iPhone. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Thomas and Stranahan, Fault Lines. So let's take a break and let's come back. And we will be back in a moment. And again, this is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And our guest for this segment, Garland Nixon. He's a Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended. Those air right here on Radio Sputnik from Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern. That, by my count, is 3 to 5 p.m. Pacific. Garland, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
Great. Good morning, gentlemen.
Great to hear. Thank you again for being with us. All right, I'm going to start it off like this. What have you thought about the last couple of weeks of debates? I'll just start right there.
Well, or the lack thereof, in watching them, the same thing that I've been, thinking for a long period of time, and that is, rather than debate the issues, the U.S. political, the entities out there that should be debating the issues, including our media, are avoiding the issues. That's what I saw there. We're making it, it's kind of cultish stuff where we talk about the personalities and we say, you're a bad guy. Oh, how dare you talk about my son? Things of that nature. But when it comes to the actual things that the American people need, there's no discussion of that. It's absurd. And we'll get into why.
Well, yeah, I agree with you on that. I mean, the American public seems to be an afterthought. And that was true in the debates or those beauty pageants that they were calling the committee, the conferences. People, especially on the left, have this tendency to look at Donald Trump and say he's the worst thing on the planet, he's the worst thing ever. But is that really true in this context, especially if you're looking at this as a contest from the standpoint of the left and left-leaning politics and what is the best interest in regards to pushing forward a policy agenda? Is Donald Trump the worst aspect of that? And I can point to several items, right? I can point to several items where that answer becomes a no. What do you think about it?
Here's the thing about Donald Trump. As a man who practices the discipline of Zen, what's the big thing you're looking for in Zen, right? Enlightenment, knowledge, wisdom, right? The one thing that Donald Trump gives us, paradoxically, is knowledge and wisdom. He doesn't know. He's not, a longtime member of the team. So he doesn't know that he's not supposed to say we're stealing the oil from Syria. We like oil. Instead, he's supposed to say we're bringing human rights and democracy to Syria, but he doesn't know that. So the great thing about Donald Trump is, he exposes these powerful entities and weakens them because their power is in their anonymity. Even though he's part of that machine, if you look at what he's done with his corporate tax cuts and with his, bailouts, et cetera, he's part of that monster. But he doesn't have enough sense to know that you shouldn't say these things. So, that you can argue that Donald Trump's been a blessing in how he's enlightened people about the reality of U.S. policy.
If Biden is a wall, Trump is something like a window. He's intentionally and not. He's transparent. He's showing what's going on, not just in his head all the time on Twitter, but he's not lying about some of the key things here. How do you balance that? Isn't this in some sense exactly what voters want? I mean, how do you think this is hitting the DNC's base, the voter base there? How do you think this is going to affect that? Do you think might take very, very briefly is I don't think they're represented. I think there's not a majority within the DNC by any means. Now, not within the Democratic electorate, but I think there's a sort of silent and growing minority of people who don't like either of the candidates, but at least they like the idea that Trump is more or less honest. What's your take, Garland?
Well, I'll put it like this. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is, we talk about this within the context of the next couple weeks, right? Who's going to win. But the Democratic strategy is about you talk about a short-term strategy. This is a strategy that says we're going to do whatever we can to get elected, to get this guy in, with no thought about what happens afterward. With no real acceptance that afterwards, what we're going to be looking at is, if the Democrats win, we'll just go with that for a second, a party who has decoupled from their ruling coalition. Parties are every party's a coalition. You can look at all the different groups in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. There's a significant portion of the Democratic Party who do not agree with the guy they're putting in, don't like him, and aren't really thrilled about the policies that he's advocating for. If you get in power and the leadership of your party is at odds with the supposed ruling, with the coalition that you have, man, that is a recipe for disaster. And here's what's being revealed: that both parties have the same ruling coalition. The ruling coalition is not the progressives or the centrists on one side. No, the ruling coalition are big banks, big tech, military industrial complex, the intelligence agencies, and Israel. The ruling coalition now has no relevance whatsoever to the electorate, and it's a noble class coalition. And the thing about Donald Trump is he exposes that, because, as the Persians say, the Persians have one of my favorite quotes, and that is, "Thank God for making my enemies fools." That's what Donald Trump does. He's in my opinion, he's a bit of a fool in a lot of ways, but he's a good fool in some ways, in that he exposes the monster, the fangs of the beast.
I watched, Trump is doing rallies now. He's up there dancing on stage and doing rallies. And we have this situation where it seems that Biden is ahead in the polls. Like, I think they had one saying going all the way back to 1937, the candidates was ahead that far. By the same token, you don't see it out in support. Is this just a sleepwalk campaign where you have people who are like, all right, I'm voting for the guy, but I have no energy, enthusiasm to make this vote. And so, no, I'm not going to put out placards. I'm not going to put out signs in my yard. I'm not going to put out these things. Because people are making this conversation of saying, well, how is Biden ahead this far if indeed you don't see it in regards to driving by in your neighborhoods and your communities? What do you think about that? Is that just a sleepy campaign where this is what a campaign looks like when 70, 80% of the people voting for the guy is doing so entirely to get the other guy out of office?
I think it reflects the Democratic Party strategy, and for all that the polls say that Biden is going to win, I won't be surprised if he loses. I won't be surprised in the slightest if I can ride around and I never see a Biden sign. Ever do I see a Biden sign, and I see Trump signs all over the place. The fact of the matter is that the Democratic Party has decided to just say, we're going to run somebody. We know you don't like him, but vote for him anyway because that guy over there is worse. Biden could lose. Everyone thinks that this thing is over. I don't know about you guys. What do you guys think? I don't think it's over. What happens if the voter enthusiasm, two things, voter enthusiasm for Biden doesn't exist. And as we've learned in the past, there's a significant portion of people who vote for Trump who won't come out and say it because they're afraid of, that people are going to call him a Nazi or names or whatever. Those two things together,
right?
The polls don't look good for Trump, but I can't say any way, shape, or form that I would be surprised if he wins.
That is the thing there. Yeah, I can't help but agree with you. I mean, I don't know how it's going to go. I'm not going to try to prognosticate in that way, but I keep having flashbacks to 2016 when everybody, except for a bunch of Trump supporters, everybody was surprised that Trump won. 538, calling it pretty squarely for Biden at that point. And I feel like the problems with polling, the problems with this misrepresentation of the electorate, by the media class, by pollsters, et cetera. I can't help but feel like that's gotten worse as time has gone on, not better. How do you think we got to this? I know we've had this conversation a couple of times before, but in the Democratic Party, there's this ongoing and apparently increasing negligence of what a lot of folks actually want. And it seems like a lot of the conversation has been drowned out by identity politics and other, there's some important issues in there, but they're not issues that strike at the core of most people's hearts or needs in terms of, economic demands, things that would be good, frankly, for their families, not just themselves, but that would support their families, whether it's Medicare for all. There are different ways you can slice that joint, but not to use a very anti-vegetarian metaphor there, Garland. But how did that happen? Where did they go wrong, Garland?
Well, look, they plotted a course. They decided this is the economic course that we're going to take, which is, the term, whatever you want to call it, neoliberalism. Some people call it a brand of libertarianism, whatever you call it. But we all know how it works, the globalism. They charted that course, and that course works quite well if you're very wealthy. The reality is that the economic system that we have is a self-serving racket for the wealthiest people on earth. We've just recently seen there's some estimates from the UN that 150 billion people, or 150 million people, will be thrown into poverty, extreme poverty, because of the pandemic. But the billionaires on this earth have increased their wealth by $110 trillion. So the reality is it doesn't work. And they have to continue to lie to people. And let me add this. And we talk about it as though it's the Democrats and the Republicans. I will guarantee one thing is very obvious to me. The Democrats and the Republicans are working together. They're not going to do a stimulus bill. They ain't going to do it. And both sides aren't going to do it. And they're working together to take Trump out. This is one big Lincoln project. I mean, if you look at it right now, what's going on? The Democrats say, we want whatever, 2.2 trillion. Trump is steadily going up. Okay, 1.2, 1.4, 1.6. He's going up. He wants a deal. The Democrats could get a deal. They don't want a deal. And the Republicans are sitting on the side, just kind of, twiddling their thumbs. The two sides appear to have come together to take Trump out because they ain't two sides. This is a system. And what we're being done is there is a system, and we are being misled to believe that within the context of this system, there's two sides fighting each other. Well, if they have the same donors, they can't be two sides. And that's the discussion. You know what I mean? In reality is, how do you ferret out the reality that this is one system and that we're being played? And this is all of, weapons of mass destruction, Russiagate. It's all the same fraud.
Garland, I really appreciate you coming on to the show, man. With the Lincoln Project stuff and, basically trying to take Trump out, you think McConnell is basically in on it? I mean, because basically Trump is at 1.8 trillion, Pelosi is at 2.2 trillion, and basically that gap is so narrow. Like, in real terms, that gap is so narrow, and yet they can't seem to mind the gap. You think this is a McConnell in on it to basically take out the president of the United States?
No question in my mind. There's no question in my mind. There's so many things going on right now. I mean, they have to do it from the perspective of the people who they answer to. And one group that they answer to is the intelligence agencies. And if you look at what's going on right now, the Barr-Durham investigation is clearly a cover-up. There is mountains of evidence now, that there was basically a coup attempt. And I'm not a Trump, I'm a far left guy. I was a Bernie guy, but it's blatantly obvious that the intelligence communities were working together to have a coup attempt. They can't let that reality get out. They can't let the truth get out. It would be destabilizing even more destabilizing than our destabilized country, but even more destabilizing if the truth got out. So I think they're all working together with a number of groups. But now I tell you who probably isn't thrilled about it: Benjamin Netanyahu. He's probably on the other side because he loves the ground Trump works on. He's a man on an island right now.
Yeah, but he's by himself on this one. I think he's by himself on this one.
What's that?
All right, Garland, that's the voice of Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. And we will be back in a moment with Mark Frost You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
We increase activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, joining you from the capital of the U.S., Washington, D.C. With us, Mark Frost, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine capitalist, Schuppetenarian, and recovering libertarian. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's always good to be on.
Absolutely. Welcome. So let me ask you this.
Maybe I won't be called a Russian asset this time.
Right.
Every time. I don't think there's been one time it hasn't happened.
Calling you a Russian asset?
But I think every single time.
So let me ask you this. Let's start at the debate.
No, Mark, just to be clear, that is ridiculous. I just want to be clear. That is ridiculous, but I do consider you an asset to our show. So thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sorry you get that flag.
Well, thank you.
It's totally off base. It's weird how people go after you like that.
Don't get the territory, right?
It's unfortunate. It really is unfortunate. I mean, because honestly, what we were talking about oftentimes is just, look, this is just our take, right? This is just our take. And it's stuff that you can't necessarily say on mainstream media, but you have to ask, why can't you say it if it's true? And so let's start here. The debates. I don't think you were on the last time since they had the debates, whether it was the Kamala Harris and the Pence debate, or whether it was the Biden and Trump debate. What did you think about that? Because what it's looking like now is that it didn't help Trump. It looked like it might have been to his detriment on a few counts. One, it seems that the public, look, I thought Trump affected what he wanted to do, meaning I want to get Biden to repudiate his base over and over and over and over again, believing that that was the pathway to getting or chipping away at Biden's support. What Trump didn't realize was that the base was already broken and that attacking the base over and over again would not get the results that he wanted. And it seems, at the very least based on polling, and we can have this conversation about polling versus support in the grand scheme of things. Meaning when you go out, you don't really see the support, but in the polling, it shows up. But it didn't seem to work, or it didn't seem to accomplish his objectives. So what do you think about that? Meaning from those debates and to the reality of now in regards to Trump and Biden in this race?
Yeah, the first debate, the presidential debate was, as a lot of people have said, was a complete poop show. I mean, it was horrible. And I thought Trump was an absolute moron in it. And he let his narcissism get a hold of him, and he didn't let Biden talk enough to where he could have hung himself. I mean, to be blunt. And that's, everybody has their personality quirks, and Trump's is, I'll argue with anyone, is narcissism. He can't lose a battle and win the war. It's just something that's part of his psyche, I think.
Do you think that's a presidential thing? Like,
no,
because Trump didn't act that way as a candidate. He acted that way as a president.
90%. Yeah, I'm voting for Trump. I'll just say it right now. That's who I'm going to be voting for, assuming I vote, and I plan to go vote. I'll be voting for Trump. But I, in the strongest possible language, cannot stand his personality. If you went back before 2020 and look at my tweets, it's all anti-Trump, because I just can't stand his personality. And then one day I was chatting with actually, it was a disgruntled Democrat that was a Bernie fan, and he he changed my mind. He's like, well, okay, think about it this way: you're not voting for your BFF. You're voting for someone to be president of the United States. Have your friends been rounded up at the middle of the night and been taken away like you were worried about? Has all this authoritarian stuff you've been writing about happened? Now look at the Democrats. Of the authoritarians, who do you fear more? Do you fear the Democrats' brand of it, or do you fear the Republicans' brand of it? Now look at foreign policy. Has Trump got us into all these nuclear wars and all this war that supposedly was going to happen? Well, no, he didn't. Well, okay, what do you think about the Democrats on that? And then, well, we all know the story on that. And one day, I'll just be blunt, I kind of let it go, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to let his personality go, and I'm going to judge him now that he's actually been president for a while on his policies. And I certainly don't agree with all of his policies, but generally speaking, he's an improvement, I think. I voted for Obama, believing it would be a new kind of presidency. I think my vote for Obama was 20% race-based and 80% I want something different than George Bush, who was a horrible president. Horrible, horrible, horrible. One of the worst, in my view. Made a mess of the Middle East. And I thought Obama would come in and smooth it all over and clean it all up, but him and Hillary made it worse. So bad, it's hard to believe it was just incompetence. It was like, did they do this on purpose? Was it purposeful? So on those debates, I was just disappointed in them. I thought the vice presidential debate was better, but still, just as a general barometer of the political climate, it's a shame we don't have better choices. I think you guys know, and a lot of the listeners know, my first choice was Tulsi, believe it or not. Somehow, she actually does bring people together. I went to a couple rallies. And the eclectic nature of people being kind and respectful as they discuss stuff with each other was amazing. The people she attracts want to live well together. And she would have been a wonderful vice presidential candidate. I'll probably be voting for Biden right now if she was the vice president. I'll be honest.
I mean, briefly on Tulsi, I think she would have actually been, it's the military background. She would have been good during the pandemic. She would have been good, yes, in different ways for sort of acting on that executive power, acting with that executive authority. And just, she seemed calm and she seemed like she had a perspective that was her own perspective. I think that's frankly what people are missing. I think that is actually, along with a lot of the sort of war realism that she brought to the table during the debates. There's some parts people could disagree with her on, but I think that was part of it too, is that she had her own standing and she was, secure and confident in that standing. What's your take, Mark?
I tend to agree with you. I think she's measured. I think she's confident without being narcissistic. And I think she actually listens, and she has enough empathy to care about people without having too much to where she becomes paralyzed by emotion. And I think she would have made a great president or vice president. My worry is, certainly most economists hate war. I mean, there are some neocons that say war is good, it does this, this, and that. But most economists just hate the idea of war because it's so very efficient. It's so very inefficient. It's so wasteful. I'm older than you guys, I think, and my entire life, my country it seems like we've been at war, or maybe that's the wrong word. We've been in conflict with somebody on a daily basis my entire life, since the day I was born, I think. And there's no reason for it. The Soviet Union's gone. I was so hopeful of a peace dividend. And then the neocons come in. And by the way, there's neocons on both sides. You can call them whatever, you can put the name on it, whatever you want. But Hillary, there's never been a bigger neocon in the history of neocons than Hillary Clinton, ever. Ever. I mean, she was more neocon than the Republican neocons. And I still believe, had she won, we'd be at war somewhere right now. I mean, a real war. So this is just a weird election because I am discouraged by people, especially on Twitter, that seem to have all the exact answers. I have a PhD and a bunch of other degrees and a bunch of life experience in business, and I don't have all the answers. I think I have the right questions to ask, but I change my mind quite often. I'm worried about the breakdown of society and the power that government is wanting to take onto itself over regular citizens. I'm a big, giant, probably my top issue is the shutdown. If I had to single out and said, Mark, what's the top of the totem pole issue for you? And it's the shutdowns. I'm going to vote for someone that is least likely to ever shut down an economy again. And I feel emboldened by saying that because now evidence is coming out, people are seeing it. The anti-shutdowners like me are starting the worm is turning, you might say. Even the European head of the WHO came out and said, yeah, it's not really a good idea to shut down an economy. World poverty is probably going to double next year. There's all sorts of unintended consequences of these things, which economists have been arguing about since the shutdown talk first started. And I believe, as I tweeted 6 months or so ago, that when the dust is settled and we start measuring stuff, we're going to see that just like after 9/11, our reaction to this exogenous shock, this COVID-19 virus, was more damaging than the virus itself. And that's my politics right now, primarily. That's what's driving me mostly. You can't shut down an economy like this and put it on the backs of poor people, and that's what we've done. I'm not hurting. I'll just tell you right now, I'm not hurting from the shutdown. I have more money now as a result of the shutdown. My business improved because of contactless payments. I don't even advertise. People call up. I need contactless payments. I hear you do it. I need it. I need it now. And it's a shame because the people that are suffering through this are the poor people that live paycheck to paycheck, the so-called working poor or the lower middle class. And I'm offended that these adult politicians cannot put their egos on the shelf for long enough to at least pass. Make it stand alone. Pass what you can agree on. Pass provisions that put money in the hands of the people that need it most and who just so happen to be the sort of people who are going to spend it, which is where real stimulus has to come right now. The stimulus has to be demand-driven. It cannot be supply-side trickle-down. It has to be from the bottom up because that's how you're going to stimulate demand. Because until people get out and start buying stuff, there is no stimulus. You'll have a bimodal outcomes. The people like me that already have some money are going to do better. The people that don't have anything, including a job, are going to suffer more. And I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican.
Mark, we've got to go into a break, but that sounds like the absolute imminent destruction of the middle class. That's, I mean, the bifurcation that you're talking about, where the people who are already fairly well off are going to do better, the people who aren't doing so well are going to do worse. You get that bifurcation that you're talking about? Isn't that, I mean, we've got to go into a break. I'll bring us back on the other side, but I want to talk more about this. I'm kind of coming around in some sense too. I think that frankly we should have done more earlier, and if we had nipped it in the bud, if we'd been more prepared for it, this is a long time coming in some sense. We've got decades to prepare for a virus pretty close to this one in terms of SARS as a reference point. In any event, we're joined by Mark Frost talking economics and politics. We will be back with him on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
This is Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Frost. Mark Frost, our guest. He's an economist, a professor, a consultant, a drummer, an Eagle Scout, a Marine, a capitalist, and a recovering libertarian, also a Schumpeterian. It's a reference to Joseph Schumpeter, I believe. We've had that conversation before on the air. Mark, thank you again for being with us. As we were going out at the end of the segment, we sort of started to talk about the shutdown, the lockdown, the pandemic. We're talking, of course, about the coronavirus for those traveling from some other decade who aren't aware of exactly which virus we're referring to. Mark, two things here. Actually, I'll just go with one. My one hesitation, I'm kind of against the lockdown at this point too, in some sense, or at least I think that frankly we should have done more earlier, and that now we're weirdly dragging our feet and putting a lot of people through a lot of economic misery. I can definitely see that, and I see the argument you're making too about how it's hitting the poor folks hardest. That's not a good place for society to be. But here's the thing: if we hadn't done this, we sort of can't see the other side of the iceberg. You know, in terms of a sort of sliding door view of history, we don't know what would have happened if we hadn't done a lockdown. We're seeing 200,000 deaths, well over that at this point. You know, and it's continuously rising. It could have been many more hundreds of thousands. What's your take on that argument, Mark?
Well, I'll go back. I can go dig it out. But 5 months ago or 6 months ago, I think I tweeted, by my calculations, to justify shutting down the economy the way we've done in the United States would require that we abated at least 3 million people. The shutdown is going to have ramifications for people's lives for years, if not decades. The virus is going to be dealt with, and people are going to figure out how to deal with it. Shutdowns, both from a practical perspective as well as from my philosophical view of individual rights, is, from the practical view, it's just dumb. And from the philosophical view, certainly my libertarianish values, it's complete anathema. I ran the numbers when it first started. I didn't know anything about epidemiology, but I knew a lot about mathematical modeling. So I went and started studying the journals, reading them, seeing what kind of models they're using. And I saw clearly why their forecasts were so bad. And when I say so bad, I mean, I wish there was a word that they were horribly bad. I ran them through an old ATM model that I had sold to banks, and it outperformed what they were using by orders of magnitude. And the reason is their models assume you know what the infection rate is, but they didn't know what the infection rate is. They didn't even have any idea of what it was. So they guessed at it. They put their finger in their air and they felt the wind and they chose 10% because that's what some other things have been. And it warped the forecast of their model so bad. It made the virus appear that it was going to be something much worse than what it actually was. Now, I have to be careful because every time I say that, I get some nut job that says, yeah, I like what you said. It's all a hoax. No, it's not a hoax. It's real. It should be taken serious. It should be taken seriously, and government resources should go in to preventing its spread in a pragmatic economic way. Understand, and by pragmatic economic way, meaning you give up idealism. You understand everybody's not going to social distance. You understand everybody's not going to wear a mask right. Some people aren't even going to wear masks. You understand that some cases are going to get through, but if you can get most cases, you'll do pretty well. And then there's the conditional probability. There's other diseases. The flu hits old people harder than it does young people too. We already knew that. Most of the people, so many people in nursing homes in New York, for instance, could have been saved just by some conditional probability, just understanding that if you're 5 years old, your chances of dying of this is almost zero. If you're 70 years old and you have lung issues and diabetes and you're in a nursing home, now all of a sudden that is a target group that should be separated and dealt with and extra resources put into it. That's what I would call a smart strategy of going around doing this. And that's my gripe with it. And, you know, anecdotally, I've had 2 former students, and this wasn't just where they were depressed or sad. They were on the suicide ledge, ready to kill themselves. They just couldn't take it anymore. They felt they went through all this effort to go get an education, and now there's no jobs, and there's no fun in life, and life is gloomy. It just so happened both of them were kind of extroverted personalities, and I completely understand it. They were lonely. Human beings need to function within a community. And this thought where you let epidemiologists who have one weapon, they have a hammer and every problem in the world is a nail. I blame them. I don't even blame the leaders. The leaders were taking the advice from the medical people, and the medical people have it drilled into their head. The objective function is the saving of lives. Well, that's the wrong objective function, because the marginal benefit of abating an additional death is not infinity. There's a cost to that. And as you continue to not allow more and more deaths, the cost of that abatement starts to increase exponentially.
Well, Mark, I mean, basically, though,
wake up 5 years later, people wake up 5 years later and they wonder why their money doesn't have the same buying power that it had. They wonder why they don't have the same job opportunities. And it's because we committed suicide. We chose an irrational activity like passing Patriot Acts and redevising the airports and reducing our civil liberties after 9/11.
Yeah, Mark, but this is not 9/11.
Yes.
This is a virus. And I understand the quibble, and I guess the gripe or the discrepancy here is on the cost of life. Basically is what we're talking about. I don't have the belief that shutting everything down was a problem. My belief is that the issue was more so that making sure people had the things that they needed and that we did not provide for that. And I think we agree upon that, that basically, you can't shut the government down and then turn around and not ensure that people have the things that they need while you're shutting them down and basically killing their jobs. But I think the disagreement is on the issue of the virus itself and the propagation of that and whether or not shutting things down was necessary or the correct response. And my thing is, it was a virus. It's a real thing. The economics of these things and everything else is a fudgy concept at best in regards to value. And it was the correct choice. I mean, I don't think we handled it correctly, so don't misunderstand me. But I do think you needed to social distance. And if the government needed to say that you needed to do so in regards to, to create an incentive, then I think you needed to do so. Otherwise, I don't think people would have did it at all. I don't think this would have been far worse. I think, leaving with 500,000 people dead is worse to me. Am I wrong in that assessment? What's the number of deaths that's acceptable for you in order to keep
I already
this
said
society
that.
open?
Yeah, I mean, I respect your view, and of course I respect your judgment, but I disagree with it. I already said that. I think that it would have had to have been on the scale of at least 3 million dead to warrant even thinking about it. Because shutting down the economy kills people too. It literally kills them. And we see that when we go study economic history after exogenous events. When you take people's livelihood away, when you take the ability of people to be social, you harm them. When you add not billions anymore, but when you start adding trillions at a time exogenously to the debt, you dilute the monetary pool. You dilute the value of the U.S. dollar. Now, everything imported becomes more expensive. Now, it's very difficult to measure the counterfactual. That's the problem. We don't really, you're right, we don't know because we don't have any magic way to go back and measure the counterfactual. What would have happened if we would have banned any shutdowns? And we don't know that. But as a matter of ideology and a matter of practicality, I look at it as the same way I look at roads. We could have 150 mile an hour speed limits on the highway, but we choose not to have them because when we do, we have too many people dying, and especially too many innocent people that aren't driving recklessly dying. So we make a choice in society, and it's done through voters. It's a political process, not really a medical or even an economic process. People have to reveal what they really value. And people have said, okay, I don't want 150 mile an hour speed limits, but you know what? I don't want 5 mile an hour speed limits either. Let's make it 70. And at 70, we have about 50,000 people per year die. And we can accept that. That's an acceptable cost of a mobile society. Well, I argue that an acceptable cost of a free society is 200,000 dead. It's almost an equation at that point.
But this is not a free society. I mean,
but I want it to be
for example, the very example you gave, you can't drive 150 miles an hour. Now you could.
Right.
You're going to go to jail.
Right.
But you could. I'm saying you're already
those
enwrapped.
laws are decided politically. Those laws are decided politically. A single person doesn't decide randomly, you know what? I'm going to make the speed limit 5 miles an hour because I can't stand the thought that 50,000 people a year die. We used to have 55 mile an hour speed limits after Nixon, I believe it was. Was it Nixon? Yeah, I think it was Nixon. And the states revolted and the voters revolted. And most states raised them back up from 55 to 70 and just said, I don't want your matching funds. Finally, the federal government canceled it. But that's my point. There is a trade-off between A and B. And that's why economics is sometimes kidded as the study of tragic choices. Everything you value costs something or it doesn't have a value. I value life too. I also value freedom. I also value future life. I also value macroeconomic health. And you can't add $10 billion to a national debt without mortgaging the future of generations that come after us. It's literally intergenerational theft of what we're doing right now. If the shutdown needed to happen, here's when I think a shutdown might need to happen. Let's say a new virus comes and the infection rate is 50% and the fatality rate is 70%. Now we got a serious problem. Now it's not a virus that's a really bad, nasty flu. What we have now is a virus.
I do need to interject. I apologize, but we're coming to the end of the hour. I want to say this is Mark Frost, one of my favorite guests, even though we get to argue all the time. Economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schuptenarian, recovering libertarian. Mark, thanks for coming to the show, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And this is, of course, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we're coming to you live from across the divided states of America, the most disruptive show in those states. In the politically independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall with my co-host, of course, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Line with Thomas and Stranahan. And as we do thrice, that's 3 times each morning, we're getting into the headlines once at 7, once at 8, and once at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. That's now in the news. Well, to give you a coronavirus update, a couple of little headlines here. The Freedom on the Net 2020 report, an assessment of 65 countries released Wednesday, found that the pandemic has accelerated a decline in free speech and privacy on the internet for the 10th consecutive year. That report accused some governments of using the virus as a pretext to crack down on critical speech. Never good when it happens, and it seems like any pretext will do these days. Meanwhile, residents at a nursing and rehabilitation facility in Greeley, Colorado, organized a protest last week against the state's coronavirus restrictions. Again, the thing that we keep noting here and why this is noteworthy in the first place. I'm going to read that again. Residents at a nursing and rehabilitation facility organized a protest. You really have to have a lot going against you when you're in your elderly years to want to, get out of the bed, be rolled out, whatever the case may be, in order to protest what's going on in terms of coronavirus restrictions. Of course, I'm guessing they're getting hit pretty hard. Specifically, I'm guessing they're not able to see their families. I'm guessing that's a large part of what's actually going on here is due to coronavirus restrictions. People are being kept apart. That's not good for anybody. And it's especially not good, if you really love people and you can't see them.
It's aggravating.
That's
it's
super aggravating. I can't imagine dealing with that.
My grandmother is, she was last week or the week before last, was in a, it wasn't a retirement home, but it was a fitness thing. It was for like rehabilitation center. And you can't see the person. They don't allow people in. And so you would have to go to the window in order to talk to your family member, because that's the only way they would allow you to basically see that person. And even in the hospital, same thing. It's a person who's in there, and the only way they would allow the person in is if the person was like deathly ill or something to that effect. But everybody else, for the most part, had to stay out. And I gotta be honest, that gets aggravating. My rule is you never let a person go to the hospital by themselves if you can help it, because you always need somebody there that's the advocate for that person. And, whether it's a nursing home. And one other last point, with nursing homes, it was like 42% of the COVID-19 cases came from people who were from nursing homes, initially anyway. And I know the number is changing now based on the number of young people who are catching it. But beforehand, a large share was people who were either in nursing homes or the people who worked at those nursing homes. So I don't blame them.
Yeah, and here's the thing, you can't blame the people who are operating these facilities from trying to keep folks safe. And they know that, every person who comes in is potentially a vector for the disease. So it's not like I'm slamming the administrators here, but I kind of see both sides of it. And I mean, the other side of this is we're all having this conversation because we didn't effectively deal with the problem in the first place. I just really want to beat this home. I know it's hard to view these parallel universes, how things could have gone if we'd done things differently. But in some sense, that's all you have to go on if you're trying to learn from your mistakes. And frankly, if we had done a lot more, a lot sooner, and well in advance of this pandemic, if we'd built up our infrastructure in terms not just of things like masks, potentially stuff like ventilators early on, if we'd not just done that, but if we'd had a thriving technological sort of upward growth where, I'm rambling a little bit here. If we had some foresight in terms of how we live and how we work, if the economy were working a little bit better, so that instead of basically shafting our parents and our grandparents and putting them into the homes because we can't afford to take care of them, or, our society is so detached from our own experience that we kind of put them in these places. There are all these different ways into this specific problem, but frankly, it's a huge problem. It may be a topic for another time. Anyway, in our next headline, Judge Amy Coney Barrett's Supreme Court confirmation hearings continue into the third day today. Yesterday was day 2 of those hearings, and Judge Barrett was questioned about her positions on issues such as abortion and gay rights. She repeatedly cited the Ginsburg rule, so she did not have to engage in hypotheticals. She said, and I quote, Justice Ginsburg, with her characteristic pithiness, used this to describe how a nominee should comport herself at a hearing. No hints, no previews, no forecasts. That has been the practice of nominees before her, but everybody calls it the Ginsburg rule because she stated it so concisely, and it's been the practice of every nominee since. End quote. And that's apparently, her practice too. That fits with the mode. She did not use notes for the entire day of questioning. When asked if she would work to overturn the Affordable Care Act and Roe v. Wade, she said that she had made, quote, no commitment, end quote, to do so to the White House. And as we've been talking about, we can go back and forth on this. I don't think she should have to make a commitment. She doesn't need to. They're picking her because they think that she'll vote their way on these things. And I mean, I think we both agree the way that it's so politicized, the way that each party can just try to take the absolute most, extract the utmost concessions from the political system in order to push their own needs is deeply frustrating on a both a logical and an emotional level. Anyway, Jamarl, what's your take?
Well, I mean, but this kind of goes along with, look, as a chess player, when I look at this stuff, I think from the standpoint of you are going to get certain outcomes based on certain things that you do, or based on certain ways that you set a system up. So if you set up something as a competition, it is, rational to believe that people are going to behave as such as a competition. And in our political system is a competition. It's not a collective come together, try to figure out how to do X or Y in the best interest of it. It's not that. It's my job is to win because I get certain advantages, material advantages, when I win. And that's what you're saying. That's what I mean when I say it's practical, it's rational to try to put somebody on that bench that is in your best interest. Why would you do that otherwise? Like, why would Joe Obama come out and put somebody on the bench that would be against democratic concerns? He wouldn't. Neither will Republicans. I mean, he may give you somebody who's milquetoast, but Republicans are going to put somebody who's is in their interest. And by the way, Joe Biden has just came out yesterday. They were ragging on him about, are you going to pack the court? Are you going to pack the court? Well, right here. After weeks of declining to address the topic, the Democratic presidential nominee told Cincinnati he's not a fan, quote unquote, not a fan of expanding the number of courts on the Supreme Court. Biden added, I want to keep focused. The president would like nothing better than to fight about whether or not I would pack the court. Now, beforehand, Biden said, it's none of your business whether I'd pack the court. You'd find out once I get into office, which I made the point it was unacceptable as a commentary. And same thing with Kamala Harris. She doesn't want to talk about it. She doesn't want to give an answer. Well, this is a non-answer also. I'm not a fan of it. Doesn't mean you won't do it. You need to answer that question.
That's great. That's exactly what we want from, the people who are running for the president, is to hear them defer their policies until after they get elected. That's exactly where we want to be. No, my sarcasm is pretty obvious there. Next headline here. Today, the New York Post is reporting that the Obama administration let a Democratic PR company that worked for Ukrainian energy firm Burisma take part in a conference call about an upcoming visit to Ukraine by then Vice President Joe Biden. This came out in emails that the New York Post apparently obtained. Joe Biden, kind of the viceroy of Ukraine in some sense, the vice president at the time, of course, and he was in charge of Ukrainian policy, working closely, can only assume, with the State Department, with people like Victoria Nuland and probably Strobe Talbot. An associate at Blue Star Strategies then emailed a memo within minutes of the conference call hosted by the White House to a top Burisma executive. That name is Vadim Posharsky, as well as to Joe Biden's son, Hunter, and Hunter's business partner, Devon Archer, both of whom sat on Burisma's board. The trip in December 2015 turned out to be the one during which Biden later bragged about forcing Ukrainian officials to fire a state prosecutor who was investigating Burisma by threatening to withhold a $1 billion U.S. loan guarantee. So the corruption questions there about whether Biden, the senior Biden, Joe Biden, was using his office to benefit his son's company, he's been denying it for at least months. I'm pretty sure years now. I'm pretty sure this goes back years at this point. But this is a huge story, huge deal here, actually. This is a link right there with the Obama administration, working with them. Anyway, next headline here. Tensions are rising in Mexico over a long-standing water dispute between the U.S. and Mexico, pitting Mexican farmers against their own president and the global superpower next door. That's the U.S., of course. The farmers armed themselves with sticks, rocks, and homemade shields, ambushed hundreds of soldiers guarding a dam, and seized control of one of the border region's most important bodies of water. The Mexican government was sending that water, their water, to Texas, leaving them next to nothing for their thirsty crops. That's according to the farmers, of course. They say they took over the dam and have refused to allow any of the water to flow to the United States for more than a month. Negotiating the exchange of water between the two countries has long been strained, but rising temperatures and long droughts have made the shared rivers along the border more valuable than ever, intensifying the stakes for both nations. Lebanon and Israel began indirect talks on Wednesday over their disputed maritime border, with American officials mediating the talks that both sides insist are purely technical and not a sign of any normalization of ties. The U.S. has been mediating the issue for about a decade, but only earlier this month a breakthrough was reached on an agreement on a framework for U.S.-mediated talks. The development comes against the backdrop of Lebanon's spiraling economic crisis, the worst in its modern history, and following a wave of U.S. sanctions that recently included two influential former cabinet ministers allied with the militant Hezbollah group. Israel, the United States, as well as some other Western and Arab countries consider the Iran-allied Hezbollah a terrorist organization. By the way, I'm calling it a militant Hezbollah group. Hezbollah is a political party. You had Maram Sousli on. She was telling us from her Syrian perspective, she sees Hezbollah with its military wing as a sort of paramilitary organization working with the Lebanese state. I kind of need to batten down the hatches in terms of looking into all this stuff more, because I'm still a little bit fresh behind the ears here. But from everything I've heard, that's right. Beirut hopes that oil and gas discoveries in its territorial waters will help it overcome the crisis and pay back its massive debt that stands at 170% of the GDP. That makes it one of the highest debt to GDP ratios in the world. Yesterday, Apple revealed the iPhone 12, its first 5G phone, and top Chinese social media platforms reportedly pulled their planned coverage of Apple's iPhone 12's live stream, despite massive interest in the event. Specifically, video platforms such as Tencent Video, Iqiyi, Bilibili, and Weibo didn't carry the event, despite originally planning to. The report from Bloomberg said that platforms gave no explanation for not showing the event in China. That's Apple's second largest market by revenue. And the iPhone 12 was later ranked the top topic on Weibo, with users posting photos of the new phone. So it's not that they didn't show it due to a lack of popularity or interest. This is my little editorial guess here. It's that they're competitors with Apple, and they're trying to distance themselves from American markets as a part of, the trade war with China, with China trying to distance us from American markets, specifically from Huawei, phone company. Anyway, that's the assumption there. And in my last headline this morning, in Cambodia, today it was reported that more than 10,000 people have been evacuated after a tropical storm triggered flash floods. Seasonal rains made worse by the storm caused flooding in 19 of the country's 25 provinces that affected 140,000 people in all, according to a spokesman for the National Committee for Disaster Management. Flooding also destroyed thousands of hectares of rice. And the capital, although not badly hit, had police move more than 500 families in a southern part of the city to safer ground. And with that, you've listened to our headlines on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're going into a break. We will be back in just a minute. We're having a conversation with Ben Swann. Stay tuned for that. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and our guest, Ben Swann. He's an award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and a host on the program Boom Bust that airs weekdays on RT America. Ben, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to start it here real quick. It's been a little while since we've had you on. Big news in terms of the election. A couple of debates, first the presidential, then the vice presidential. Then Trump got sick with COVID, hospitalized, and apparently very quickly recovered after receiving a cocktail of drugs. Now that he's out, though, the second presidential debate got canceled. There's a bunch of back and forth on that. I'm just going to ask you very broadly, what are your thoughts on the last couple of weeks? Maybe we can start with the first presidential debate. And, secondarily, what do you think about this second debate getting canceled? How do you think that's going to play out? What's your personal opinion, Ben?
Yeah, it's been fairly interesting. I think that if you go back to the first debate, I don't think anyone saw that as a great debate by any means. In fact, I think it's the debate system as it is right now has really kind of devolved into something that's not interesting to viewers. It doesn't really answer questions. The moderators, the line of questioning they ask is basically the same conversations they have on cable news all day long. So it's almost like a regurgitation of the same ideas. There's very little that's done to actually challenge a candidate to take a stand on something. The moderators are much more timekeepers at this point than they are actually trying to derive information. And then the candidates don't answer the questions. So I think when you sit and watch it, the first presidential debate was 90 minutes of, I can't believe we're sitting through this. I think the fact that the next one's been canceled isn't a huge surprise. I would like to see them debate again, but if it's the same as before. Instead, they're both going to hold rallies. Both Biden and Trump are going to hold rallies. And the reality is that that's all the debate really was in the first place. It's just a rally. Nobody is actually answering, tough questions. The point of a debate is to help the viewers and the voter to understand your positions and to contrast those positions. That does not happen in our debates.
That doesn't happen. And maybe this needs to go back to the League of Women Voters. Maybe that's where it needs to be.
Yes.
Because I agree with you. Because instead of having a candidate come out and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do to deal with this particular situation, and have a full-throated conversation about it, that doesn't happen. I mean, and that hasn't happened for a while. I mean, even during the primaries where you didn't have Trump being boisterous and everything else, it still didn't necessarily happen. So where does this need to go in order to help the public get anything out of this situation? Because right now, like you said, the second debate is canceled. We have no idea if there's going to be a third debate and what that third debate is going to be about, or whether that third debate is even going to be helpful at this point, considering people have basically nailed down their opinions and their points of view. So what does this need to go in order to kind of make this process better?
Well, I 100% agree it needs to go back to the League of Women Voters. The fact that it's run by this quote-unquote nonpartisan Commission on Presidential Debates, which is absolutely untrue. It is run by the bipartisan, meaning two parties run it, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So it needs to go back to the League of Women Voters. Remember that the Commission on Presidential Debates established all the rules and took over shortly after Ross Perot made it to the debate stage. He was the last third party or independent candidate to make it onto a national presidential debate stage. And that was the end of that. And the commission has made sure since Ross Perot almost 30 years ago that no one else would be allowed to do that. So I think what we see is, number one, I would say, it goes back to the League of Women Voters. Number two, those two parties cannot control the debate process. That's insane. And because by giving them control of the debate process, what you are submitting to is the idea that those two parties control the White House, and they're the only ones who have the right to control the White House. That is not true. Also, I think that you have to allow for other voices on that stage. The libertarians are on the ballot in every single state in the country. Green Party is on enough ballots to win the White House. Those two parties should be allowed to debate. If your party has enough ballot access, or you as an independent have enough ballot access to get enough electoral votes to win the White House, you should absolutely be allowed on the debate stage. Polling should have nothing to do with it. It should have to do with ballot access. If you're on the ballot, then you have a chance to debate. And what would happen is you would force, by having more voices on the stage and more points of view on the stage, you would force issues to be covered instead of it being a choose the lesser of two evils. I'll tell you why that opponent is much worse than me. That's what it is right now. It's a back and forth between you have two choices. So it's basically like flipping a coin. But if you had 4 choices or 5 choices, you actually force candidates to talk about issues. We have more talk of issues in the primaries than we do in the general election campaign debate stage.
How did we get there? You brought up the League of Women Voters. You talked about sort of hinted at a long-term decline in the standing in the role of debates, whether or not people actually are saying things that voters care about, or whether they're just debating within this sort of closed, hermetic chamber of ideas. Ben, real quick, in your opinion, how did we get to this point where it's so degraded?
Well, we got to this point because we cut out the additional voices. When Ross Perot ran in 1992, he actually had a legitimate shot of winning the White House as an independent candidate. I think prior to him running, people really hadn't seen that being a possibility. And yet he made it a possibility. Now he dropped out and then he jumped back in. And by then people didn't trust him anymore. He was a flake. But the commission decided at that point they would now control the debates to make sure that they didn't have this quote unquote spoiler. And so since then, what we've seen is an increasing partisanship in terms of the moderation of the debate. The debate's becoming more like reality TV, less on substance, because the idea for TV executives is we need to make this interesting for viewers rather than making it informative for viewers. And I think where we had a tipping point was when we saw the Republican primary debates with Trump in 2016, where the ratings were sky high because it was an insult fest. And it was very little about issues, and it was much more about this very entertaining TV. And it was entertaining, but it was entertaining TV. And I think it's only gone downhill from then for the expectation that we will have entertaining debates as opposed to informative debates.
That sounds like the profit motive at play there briefly. Just very, very briefly, at least the second part of it. The first part, there's definitely apparently a political co-optation where I guess just in quick sequence here, on point one, why would they care? This is a sort of dummy question. Why would they care about spoilers? Why it seems like the Green Party, the Libertarian Party have long been viewed as marginal. Is it just the sort of controlling the Overton window, not letting those ideas in the room, or is it actually a legitimate concern that that's going to steal votes from the main parties? What's your take, Ben?
Oh, I think they definitely they know that those parties will steal votes. Listen, if you go back to 2016. There were over 5 million votes cast for either Libertarian or Green Party candidates in 2016. But if you go state by state, and I did an analysis right after the election, state by state of the swing states that went for Trump instead of Clinton, in those cases where you might have an 11,000, 12,000, 15,000 vote difference, you had in the hundreds of thousands people voting for third-party candidates. In those swing states, they did swing the election, but it's not about swinging it for Trump or for Clinton. It was about voters saying, I don't like these two choices. And the more you give people choices, yes, you're going to have a more fractured electorate, but that's healthy. What's unhealthy is this two-party system that really becomes a corporate party. And so the corporations only have to really control 2 different candidates and the outcomes of that. And so I think what we need to see is more voices and people to say, hey, there are other ideas out here than this fake left-right paradigm.
Yeah, the moment that people believe that those parties or the third parties have credibility, then those parties have a much higher chance of getting those votes. I totally agree with you. I do want to pivot a little bit. I want to talk about the Russian, well, not the Russian docs, but Ukrainian docs. Now, this has to do with the New York Post article that came out. I believe this came out either yesterday or today. But I'll just read it. Hunter Biden introduced his father, then Vice President Joe Biden, to a top executive in a Ukrainian energy firm less than a year before Joe Biden pressured the Ukrainian government to fire a prosecutor that was investigating the company, according to the emails obtained by the Post. Now, Joe Biden said that he never talked to his son about this. And here's an email with Joe Biden and making it clear that he did talk to his son about this. There was an introduction, and we know there was an introduction because there is an email attesting to such. This is not going to have an impact on the election. But this is one of those things where you look at and you say, I don't believe that you wouldn't have a conversation about such, considering you were basically the viceroy of the Ukraine. This stuff comes out, and, it's always slightly aggravating when it comes out that people don't necessarily take more of a skeptical point of view when they're looking at or listening to what Joe Biden is saying about this stuff, considering he has a history of lying. What do you think about this? I mean, to me, it's like of course, he talked to his son about this. And now you have the smoking gun document that basically says, yes, these two did have a conversation about issues pertaining to the Ukraine.
Yeah, well, I think it's exactly that. Look, it's when you see this kind of thing coming out, it shouldn't surprise anyone. And that's part of we use the term in politics, they use the term October surprise, right? In October, you're going to have this bombshell report that comes out that's going to shake the election and change things. This is not even shocking. I don't think that most voters will change their view. And unfortunately, they won't change their view, not because they aren't paying attention to it or they don't hear about it. They won't change their view because they're not surprised by it. It's exactly what you'd expect. So when Biden says, I had no idea what he was doing with Burisma, I didn't even know he was working there. I'd never talked to him about it. I knew nothing about it. Do people really believe him? No, not really. And then when you find out that absolutely he did have knowledge, no, I'm still not surprised, right? Because the problem is that we have come to the point in our American politics where we expect the politicians to lie to us. We expect the candidates to lie to us. And so the question becomes not a question of, are you lying to me? Because we know we're being lied to. It becomes a question of, do I trust that your lies will ultimately lead to where your party is taking us? And so right now, what I think is most interesting about the Biden run for office is that this is the first time in my lifetime that I can think of a presidential candidate who's running for office who voters aren't actually voting for. They're instead being told, don't worry, there's a team around him and the team's going to do everything. And, this idea that he's competent. I interviewed the other day 2 different hardcore Biden supporters, who were 100% in for him. And I asked them, but do you, and I'm not trying to be controversial, do you believe that he has the mental capacity to be president? There's so many people who look at this man and believe he's senile. Are you concerned at all about that? And both of them said, yeah, he probably is. I mean, that was the belief from both of them. And they're hardcore, yes, we're for him. And they were making the case for why he's so much better than Trump. But you truly do believe that he may be senile? Yeah, we do believe that. So then what? Well, then we just trust that the party's going to take care of things, which means they're not actually voting for a candidate in this case. They're simply voting for a party. And I think that becomes, in my opinion, even scarier because there's no accountability. When you're not even voting for an individual person, who do you hold accountable when promises are not kept or commitments are not fulfilled?
It's weird. It puts in much starker relief, in my opinion, with Biden versus Trump specifically. Trump might have his own establishment, but Biden really is the establishment pick. I mean, to the utmost extent, like you're saying, this is a first, probably not just generationally, but even in American history, that people have sort of resigned. I don't want to speak out of turn, and please correct me if I'm wrong, anybody who's listening. We're taking calls, by the way, 202-521-1320. But I don't see any precedent here where people, instead of voting for the president or the candidate, they're basically voting a prism in that candidate who's going to, permit the various opinions of the party managers through in terms of what decisions they're making, in terms of what the actual president himself Biden, this voice, a persona, is going to be doing against Trump, the classic in 2016 anti-establishment pick. So it's weird how sort of binary it is. I want to come back in just a minute. We're talking with Ben Swann about politics, about the election cycle, and in a weird way about the degradation of the American political system. Sadly, we will be back with Ben on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas, Shane Stranahan, and our guest, Ben Swann. He's an award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and a host on the program Boom Bust that airs weekdays on RT America. And by the way, you should check out his website, truthinmedia.com. Again, that's truthinmedia.com. Ben, thank you for sticking with us. I want to sort of follow up and segue a little bit. We're talking about the debates. We're talking about misrepresentation. You're talking about the experience you had talking to two Biden supporters who were voting Biden despite saying he, apparently has serious symptoms of cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's, whatever the case. And you were basically saying they're voting for the establishment. They're voting for the party managers, or the people who are going to control what he actually does. This comes as far as I can tell. There's also a substantial wing on the left, many of them former Democrats, who reject that party wholly. And it's this weird bifurcation in American politics. Obviously, big news story over recent years is how much more polarized the United States, how much more polarized America has gotten. And usually it's just a left-right, a sort of red-blue polarity. But even in the party, specifically in the Democrat Party, you're seeing that polarization grow. I think we're going to see that in this election. What do you think? Where do you think that's going to go? What do you think is going to be the result of that? And how do you think the DNC is going to weather that storm? If they do, what do you think is going to come as a result of this, Ben?
Well, I think that we are going to see a further polarization. You have to remember that even within the Democratic Party right now, there is a lot of fracturing in terms of, from the progressives to the more establishment people. And then, of course, you have these folks who want to vote green who are unsure what to do right now. I think if they had, more attention on their candidate, you'd see, more on the left go in that direction. Same as on the libertarian side. I think if there were more people on the right, the difference with Trump, though, is that he's so non-establishment. He makes it very difficult on the right for there to be any kind of third party choice. Because he does not feel like an establishment candidate, and he has a cult following. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful about him. I just believe that he has a cult following that will follow him no matter what he does and says. And so, you're kind of combining an establishment and cult following. Whereas if you had a different kind of candidate, more of a Jeb Bush, a Ted Cruz, someone like that, you'd have more room. But I do think that as we move into this particular election, that one of the interesting facts that have come out in the last few weeks has been the discussion about, the Clinton campaign in 2016 and this guy, Jake Sullivan, who was a aide to Hillary Clinton, who was the one who reportedly, according to John Brennan's notes, came up with the idea of connecting Trump to Russia and creating this scenario, this untrue scenario about, Trump-Russia collusion. And what's important for people to remember is that same aide, Jake Sullivan, is also working now for the Biden campaign as a foreign policy advisor. And so when Trump talks about draining the swamp, we could have a long debate. It would be much longer than this show about whether or not he's actually done that or created his own swamp. However, what you can't deny is that the same characters who were all in before, the Susan Rices, the John Brennans, the James Clappers, the people who were running the spying campaigns, the people conducting these wars around the world, the people running CIA black sites, they're all coming back again. They're all lining up again to get back in. And so I think there is, yes, going to be a polarization in terms of the left-right divide, but on the issues that really matter, the issues where, we've been in these quagmire wars for 20 years and we can't seem to get out of them. And yet the same characters are now lining up to go back into the positions of authority and power. Hillary Clinton writing an op-ed recently that sounded like she was auditioning for Secretary of Defense. I can't think of a worse candidate off the top of my head for Secretary of Defense than Hillary Clinton. And so you have just the same litany of characters coming back. I think that if Biden is elected and brings all these people back into the fold, that creates even more polarization of people saying, oh my gosh, what Trump was saying about a swamp, the swamp monsters are all back again. So, and again, that's not to say that he hasn't created his own issues, but it's these same characters coming back again that I think that many people in the public didn't know about before, who now know their names. To see them come back would be pretty disheartening.
Ben, why do you think Trump waited so long to release these documents or this information? I mean, he had the presidential authority to disclose it. And so now he's basically saying, open the documents, and he's going to disclose it. Why wait so long and this close to the election?
Yeah, so I really can't answer that because I don't know what he knew. What I would say about Trump is I don't think he is as aware of what's in these documents as he pretends that he is. So I don't know if it first happened because of John Ratcliffe, who became the new DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, who first released them, and then Trump says, let's go ahead and release them. There seems to be a wall between the intelligence community and what the White House actually knows. And there seems to be a lot of resistance, even with the now current FBI director. It doesn't mean these positions should be politicized, but they don't seem to be very responsive to the chain of command up to the White House. And so I don't know how much he knows or doesn't know, were they trying to hold it because they thought this would be a bombshell similar to the Podesta, WikiLeaks emails, Hillary emails the last time around. Maybe they thought it would have that kind of an effect. Obviously, it hasn't. But we also weren't living in a Corona age at the time.
So if that's a good point. We weren't living in the Corona age at the time. Basically, if there was nothing else going on, then maybe it would have that particular effect or that bombshell effect. We were having this conversation here about whether Donald Trump was, let's say, the lesser of the two evils, or for that matter, Biden, the lesser of the two evils in the way they were thinking about it. But I think we recognize that both of these parties are basically run by the same groups. At the very least, the people who are putting money behind the parties are basically the same. And so you get policy that kind of ends up being very similar. Do you think, though, that there is what do you think the key difference is between these two, meaning Biden and Trump? And from the standpoint of better and lesser. Like, so if we're talking about foreign policy, for example, I would say, yeah, Trump is probably better on foreign policy if you're talking about less wars. When you get into domestic policy, I think you're getting more into, okay, well, I think Biden, if you're living under a particular person, Trump is Trump is worse in that scenario. How do you frame this when you're looking at these two and which one may take power and which one may be better or lesser, depending upon the sphere of influence that these guys are working through?
Well, I think your analysis is right so far. I think if you're talking about foreign policy, obviously, I would have to say Trump is better. I think Trump has not been able to do at least what he says he wants to do, which is to fully pull out of places like Syria, to completely come home from places like Afghanistan. Still has not accomplished those things, which is just stunning to me that he, when he brought in someone like John Bolton to be his national security advisor, horrible choice. So I think he's kind of there's been an ebb and flow where it seems like he was going to do the things he said, and then he's pulled back, and now he heads back that way. Whereas with Biden, I think it's pretty clear what we're going to get. We're going to get more intervention. We're going to get, basically the Obama policies of the previous 8 years before Trump. We're going back to those, right? More intervention, more drone strikes, and more toppling of governments around the world. On the domestic issues, look, I think it depends on where you are, on a lot of these issues. Biden, it seems like, is going to adopt some of these ideas of free college to some extent, free healthcare to some extent. but he wants to be like the Bernie light. He doesn't really want to go as far as what the progressives are pushing him towards. So we might get kind of a piecemeal, similar to what we had with Obama, who wanted some of these things but didn't want to go as far as he was being pulled. So it becomes, I think, a little difficult to determine what that ultimately looks like. But I do think one of the questions I was most interested in the VP debate, and VP debates are traditionally exhausting to watch because you're really listening to two people who have no policymaking power. But at the same time, we're listening to this discussion. And one of the first questions that was asked that we never got an answer to was about mandates, mask mandates, vaccine mandates. Will those mandates happen in this continued kind of corona lockdown under a Biden campaign? And Senator Harris was asked about this. She did not answer those questions. She did not refuse to answer the question as to whether there would be mask mandates and vaccine mandates, and only talked about how she would take a vaccine if the authorities agreed with it. Well, there are a lot of Americans and people around the world, but especially Americans, who are very concerned about that issue, legitimately so, concerned about whether or not they will be mandated to take a vaccine, which, by the way, Johnson & Johnson, you probably just saw, just had to stop their vaccine trials because someone became very sick going through these trials. So there's a lot of concern about that. That is a very legitimate question that was asked in the debate, and we did not get an answer to it, nor have we gotten an answer from the Trump side. What would be your position? Trump talks about, I have the military ready to go and deploy this. Okay, great. Does that mean you have the military ready to go for mandated vaccinations of coronavirus, or is this a voluntary system? So I think those kinds of questions are when I was talking earlier about how we only get the questions from the moderators that basically are the same regurgitation of what's talked about on cable news all day, instead of going through legitimate questions that voters would have about their own freedom, their own health, their own rights. I think that was sorely missing. So I think we're going to see definitely some contrast in how these two would run the nation. The question really comes down to, though, is Biden, anything he says, does any of it count? Because who's actually running it? I think that's what makes it scary for a certain number of people.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Biden on there on the debate stage, not saying much, of course, because Trump was kind of over-talking him all the time, but also just not saying much. And when he was talking, he was usually asking for people to vote for him. He wasn't giving a policy agenda. On the mask issue, I actually see that you were recently covering this. Can you just tell us briefly, we've only got a couple of minutes left, about the CDC study that I saw you were reporting on that said that basically 70% of people who had contracted COVID, who tested positive, had been wearing masks regularly? Briefly, what's your take on that study, Ben?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So very quickly, the way it worked was there was a group of about 314 people who did contract COVID that the CDC monitored. They worked with 11 different medical agencies to track these people. This was in the month of July. They've just published this. And what they're essentially saying is 70% of the people who said they always wore a mask. That means they wore it into stores. They wore it in their cars. They wore it in parking lots. They social distance. They kept their distance from people. Of the people who always wore it, 70% contracted COVID within 14 days after exposure. Of the people who said they often wore it, that was another 12% of the people. So almost 90% of the people that they tracked who wore it always and often contracted COVID within 14 days of exposure. On the other end, when people who said they never wore it, only 3.9% of those people contracted COVID within 14 days. That goes back to, if you look at the studies, and this is frustrating to me, guys, that we have a decade's worth of science about masks and whether they work or not. There have been multiple studies. These are not politicized studies of whether or not masks work in preventing viruses. One of the biggest warnings you find over and over in those studies for the past decade has been the warning that when people wear cloth masks and they put them on their face, that they actually can be more likely to contract a virus, because when you wear a mask, and you guys probably know this if you have to wear them, you're constantly touching your face. You constantly reach up and adjust your mask. You're constantly moving it around. As you speak, it slips. And so you actually have more contact with your face when you wear a mask than when you don't wear a mask, and that the masks only stop large particles. So, we've had debate back and forth of whether or not this applies to coronavirus, but this study shows some pretty striking numbers, and we break it all down in this piece that we just released yesterday. Pretty striking numbers in terms of those who contracted the virus within 14 days of exposure, always wearing a mask. It was far higher than those who did not wear a mask.
Very interesting. Yeah, that fits. I just saw that coming out as well. I mean, one other side of this, we've got to go out here, but one other side of this is, and I've heard this, if you're wearing a mask, you're more likely to get particles in there. Like you're saying, it doesn't actually block them out. But what you might get are smaller numbers of those particles. And if you get if you get less virus coming in, to put it in the simplest terms, you're likely to get less sick. So in a weird way, it seems like people are more likely to test positive because they're getting sick, but they're also more likely to have an asymptomatic sickness. Anyway, I'm not a medical professional. There's a lot more to talk about here, I'm sure. In any event, Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Guys, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
We're just talking with Ben Swann, award-winning television news anchor, investigative journalist, and a host on the program Boom Bust that airs weekdays on RT America. You should also check out his website, truthinmedia.com. We will be back in a minute, and we're taking calls, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we are taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. Again, 202-521-1320. Also, in case you don't know where to listen to us, even though you already are, we're on the radio on AM, FM in DC and in Kansas City. If you want to catch us out in DC, here's how. You should listen to us on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM. I say or because I don't know how you listen to us on both bands at the same time. And if you do, your ears are probably hurting. We're also on in Kansas City at 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1440 AM. Also, if you're digging what Jamarl and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, please give us a like and share that video or that audio. We're on audio platforms, including the Sputnik app. We're also on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. For video, just go to YouTube and do a search for either Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas, and either one of those search queries will take you to our live feed. We have a call. We've got a Tarif on the line. We're also still taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, Jamarl and Shane. Yesterday, Eva Barret and Vanessa Billy, the BBC is about to do a hit piece on them, trying to connect them to terrorism because they exposed the White Hammer and also the false Syrian gas attack. So please donate to Eva Barret and Vanessa Billy. They're about to go after them. Nancy Pelosi yesterday came out and said some things. I mean, I can't believe Blitzer stood up for people, and Nancy Pelosi just went after Blitzer for standing up for the average man and woman. And that was a golden opportunity for Trump to respond.
Well, Nancy Pelosi called him an apologist. She said, "Why are you always an apologist for the Republican Party?" And yeah, she went after him. It was like a tit for tat. I don't know if you've seen the video, Shane. It's fascinating to watch. But Wolf Blitzer is like, basically, you should stand up for America. Or like, I see these people who are hungry in the food banks and you're not helping. And Nancy Pelosi is like, I feed them. It's like, okay. It's a fascinating back and forth. But go ahead, Tarif. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so the point is this. Trump missed a golden opportunity yesterday to jump on that and push a stimulus program. Somebody's in Trump campaign do not want Trump to win. It's slowly chipping at his Trump potential voters. I'm talking about they're trying to take away moderates from Trump, independents, and leftists, and all that. He tweeted out a tweet about a elderly of Joe Biden in the elderly home being senile. Okay, now think about Florida. Think about how many senior citizens live in Florida. Think about Florida being a swing state. That wasn't a good look for him to tweet that out yesterday. Especially, he could have responded to Nancy Pelosi. Somebody in his administration is very slick, and they're trying to take away about 10,000 here, 100,000 here people from Trump, or maybe a million here, bit by bit. The same people that told him to stop the negotiation with the stimulus 2 weeks ago, probably the same people that got him to tweet that tweet out yesterday. I don't know if y'all saw that tweet, but when I saw it at first, I say something strange about the street. Then I saw a tweet from somebody else. I said, okay, I see what it is. Somebody in his Trump administration want him to lose. You need to fire him. Okay? You need to fire him. Fire him. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Tarif. Tarif, unfortunately, I think that person is Trump himself. What do you think, Shane? I mean, I think the blow up over the debt negotiation, I think he just got annoyed and put out a tweet. I think he gets annoyed and puts out tweets. And I think sometimes these things are to his detriment. As for the larger political thing about people, behind him putting a knife in him, maybe, but again, is this atypical of Trump's behavior under normal circumstances? I don't think it is. What do you think, Shane?
I don't know. I mean, it's speculation. I could see him being emotional, like you're saying, or I could see it being that there's some unseen chain of events going on inside the White House, or both. Frankly, it's more likely that it's both. That he's responding to something. I mean, the stimulus talks have been stalled here. I don't know what's going on with that. And I don't think anybody does. Trump has backed off. He said that nothing is going to happen. Pelosi and the Democrats are saying that they're pushing for stuff, but who knows what's actually on the line there? Who knows what they're putting forward behind the scenes, or what the deal is with the negotiations there? That's not available to us. You know what I mean?
I got to be honest. He should have just came out and said, "Yeah, I take the 2.2 trillion." Why the fight over this? And it looks so bad because basically Trump and Democrats too were willing to give tax cuts for trillions, and in this case we have $400 billion difference that you don't necessarily want to give to the American public. That just seems horrific. Just accept it. Now the catch becomes Mitch McConnell. Because what Mitch McConnell knows is that there are people in his party that are not willing to accept pretty much anything for negotiation, especially a $2 trillion negotiation, again, despite the fact of the tax cuts they are willing to give for much higher numbers. And so Garland could be right. There could be people in his own party that are trying to put a knife in him and trying to stop him from getting in office. I also think that McConnell is probably planning, he has to, for a world where Democrats win and retake the Senate, where they would have the House, the Senate, and the presidency. I think all sorts of politics is being played right now at this very moment. But I don't know if this is a Trump thing. I mean, Trump should have just taken the $2 trillion. You're the president. You should have turned and attacked your party, saying, "Look, we need to give this. We need to give this." At the very least, the American public doesn't believe that is entirely on you, and that you don't want to, that you don't care enough about them to put that $400 billion in. Yeah, I think this is horrible politics in regards to the way that it looks for the president.
It is. You know what? We've got two other callers. Let's go straight to them. We've got Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's going on?
Yeah, look, I'm not calling in from Sydney. I'm somewhere in time-space reality playing Marco Polo with the authorities. Apparently, from what I believe. But yeah, anyway, I'm actually Mad Mick the Awakener on TikTok. I'm very popular. I speak very good Chinese. And I also speak a bit of Russian now too. I'd like to say Yalla Putin, Yalla Russia. And to all the Chinese listening, I'd like to say, well, I need Zhongguo. Well, I need Russia Pao.
I do not know what you're saying, man.
I love China, and I love my Russian friends. And I'd also just basically like to say, as far as Donald Trump goes, he says he's a smart negotiator and businessman. Well, he obviously doesn't know nothing about business. He has been bankrupt many times. And if you're a smart businessman, when you're racking up increasing debts and you're privatizing all your profit-making assets and reducing your revenue by giving tax back to the people, right, which isn't actually going back to the people anyway, it's going to the banksters and the corporations, you're actually decreasing your revenue at the same time you're increasing your liabilities you've got to service. And that's fine as long as the American dollar remains at 0% on negative interest rates. But once people start selling bonds into the market, it actually pushes up the yield. And you actually get a greater return than you do if you had kept on the bonds. It's called a perfectly inelastic product. Once you start selling into the market, the return is greater than you lose by selling the bond, right? So by pushing up the yield, you get a higher interest return when the bond becomes due. That's basic economics, and China knows it, and the rest of the world is selling their bonds into the market and trying to push up the yield on the American interest rate, on the American bonds. So I don't know how he figures that out. So I don't think he's a very smart businessman. And I'm not Biden the propaganda, and I'm not a propaganda dumpster. At the end of the day, you got a lot of problems there. And what's really going on in Nagorno-Karabakh, as far as I understand it, is that both Russia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan and Armenia are basically destroying ISIS, America and the Foreign Legion there, with Erdogan pushing out of Turkey and gave them passage to that area there. And they created that province, that little independent autonomous state during the Yugoslavian war under Clinton. And basically, they're all four of them are combining to smash the hell out of the PKU, because the Kurds are gone there too. The ISIS and Al Qaeda and the American French Foreign Legion.
Michael, we've got to go. Thank you for the call. I want to go straight at this point to Wood from Virginia. Wood, you're on. What's going on?
I just wanted to comment on something one of the other callers said a while back. It made me think. You said something about Tulsi. It made me think when that whole thing about the Project Veritas thing came out. I've seen a lot of lefties saying she's a mask off and she's not really left. It's like, at this point, I think we need to talk about why would anyone even want to be a part of the left, especially her. Like, the left was treating her very poorly, like the entire election. And I mean, Elizabeth Warren had to stab Bernie in the back like 3 times and in the front twice before even some people would think about turning on her. Like, why would she want to be a part of the left? It's like, we can't agree on anything. The only thing that we ever want to do is eat each other and lose. I don't even want to be a part of the left anymore. We're a bunch of idiots. But I know y'all ain't got a lot of time left, so that's about it.
Wood, thank you for the call. Jamarl, we've got to go out in a minute, but what's your take on that?
I can't say I entirely disagree with him. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard was attacked viciously, for the entire election. And it's one of those things where it's like, it seemed that people they just hated her. And it didn't entirely make sense. Like, I understand the Hillary Clinton element of it with, these guys were going after her and everything else. But for whatever reason, Tulsi Gabbard seemed to be a bee in a lot of people's bonnet. So I totally understand where you're coming from.
She's an existential threat. She along with Bernie, the problem is that they both sort of took it. They both did not, they didn't respond nearly as vociferously as I would have wanted them to, as frankly, any of their supporters, I think, would have wanted them to. Tulsi we'll see where she goes in 2024. Where she goes in the meanwhile, where she goes then, she's not going away. And, my hope here is that her presence, we'll see who else there is, but her presence can revitalize the Democratic Party, the DNC, and in some sense, American politics. But we probably shouldn't put all of our eggs in that one basket. In any event, we've got to close it out today. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thank you to our producers. Thank you to producers Raheem and Cam. Thank you to engineer Andre. And thank you to my co-host, Jamarl Thomas. We will be back tomorrow at 7 a.m. Eastern. Fault Lines signing off.
Guys, I want to thank you for joining us for Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, good show. Mark is funny. I always say Mark is one of my favorite guests because I think he is. Even though we sometimes argue and everything else, Mark has an interesting take on that stuff that doesn't just trend to the right. It trends to the right with, I guess, common sense, I want to add to it. And it's weird, despite us greatly disagreeing on that stuff. Also, the Hillary Clinton thing, the Joe Biden thing, I'm sorry, that should be a bigger deal than what it is. But it does get we kind of assumed the guy was lying. But it should be a bigger deal. I mean, Joe Biden is like, yeah, we didn't talk about that stuff. And then you have a letter with the guy basically saying that they did talk about it. Not to mention, there's apparently a 12-minute video that appears to show Hunter, who's admittedly struggling with addiction problems, smoking crack while engaging in a sex act with an unidentified woman. The crack thing is a big deal because Joe Biden spent his career locking people up in prison for crack and cocaine, with people who do crack getting longer sentences. Well, those people tended to be African Americans because crack is cheaper as opposed to of a product to get. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I'll just say it like that. And Hunter's crack habit apparently got him a job making, $80,000 a month or something? Some ungodly sum of money. All right, I'm going to end this here. I'm going to say like, share, and subscribe. And I will be back a little bit later to definitely talk about this Biden one, but again, a few other stories that are abound in our politics. So I'll see you guys in a few. Thanks all.